But we're going to find out and, of course, make sure that everybody knows on the air.
These are, of course, the two twin Trade Center buildings that are down at the foot of Manhattan, that they really are the beacons of New York. It was there that there was the explosion a couple of years ago brought about by terrorists. That's all gone through the courts. But this, we don't know anything about. We don't know about anything that has happened here other than the fact that there's obviously been a major incident there. And we're going to go to a special report now from ABC News.
This is an ABC News special report.
Now, by the entire ABC network. Good Morning America was in progress in the East Coast and the Midwest, but we're joined by the entire network just to show you some pictures at the foot of New York City. This is at the World Trade Center. Obviously a major fire there, and there has been some sort of explosion. We don't fully know the details. There is one report, as of yet unconfirmed, that a plane has hit the World Trade Center, and you can see that there is smoke there coming out of at least two sides of the building.
And as you said, there are two towers, the tallest structures in Manhattan, on the island of Manhattan. We're trying to get people on the telephone to see what more we can learn. We have no idea if it was a plane. Was it in any sense deliberate? Was it an accident? It does seem to be that there is considerable and truly terrifying damage on some of those floors at the top.
This angle is a little deceptive. As you know, there are two Trade Center towers, and the second tower there is hidden behind the first. This is really almost the picture postcard of New York City. It's that and the Empire State Building, I guess, are the two most recognizable symbols of New York. There you can see the two, well, we had there for just briefly the other angle of the World Trade Center towers, but this is confined to one of the towers on the upper floors. These buildings, I think they're 110 stories each, so this would be in the top 15 or 20 floors there.
You mentioned earlier that, of course, as we all know, years ago there was that terrorist attack. It took place down on the ground and in the underground levels and the garage levels. But again, that's not to imply that we have any reason at this point to believe that this is terrorism or not. We simply don't know. And in just a few minutes, Peter Jennings is going to be joining us from the news desk uptown, where he's going to tell us everything that he knows. We also have Don Daler on the phone, and you know he's been with us on Good Morning America for a long time. And Don, where are you and what do you know?
I'm about 4 or 5 blocks just north of the World Trade Center. And at about 10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago, there was a loud sound that I can only describe as it sounded like a missile, not an airplane. Then there was a loud explosion and immediately lots of screaming out on the streets. And I don't want to cause any speculation, but that's the only way I could describe the sound. And it was definitely not the sound of a prop plane or anything like that.
And am I right? Are you a pilot?
Well, I have flown. I do not have a pilot's license. But I grew up on military bases, and I know the sound of jets, and I've been in war zones and heard those kinds of different sounds. So, again, not to cause any kind of undue speculation, but the sound itself was not of a prop plane. It was perhaps a jet, but it could have been a missile as well.
Can you give me, was it a whining sound, Don, or what?
Yes, it was a how to describe it? It was a high-pitched, but it had a whooshing sound, not like a prop plane.
Huh. And you didn't see anything actually in the air?
No, I wasn't looking out, but we looked out immediately. You can see quite a lot of damage. If it was an airplane, it had to be huge because it hit way up in the World Trade Center. I would say it's probably a good 5-6 of the way up to the top. There's a considerable amount of flame. There's damage on two sides that I can see. On the very north-facing side, there's where looks like is the largest amount of damage. There's a gigantic hole that encompasses a number of floors. I would say maybe 10 to 15 floors. And then on the left side, which would be the east side, there's considerable damage as well, and lots of flames and smoke coming out of it.
You know, I don't know that people outside New York realize it, but these two buildings are essentially cities in and of themselves. I mean, there's 30 to 40,000 people, if I remember the number, and I'm doing this from memory.
Yes.
Number of people who actually work in these buildings, and this obviously occurred at the time that people were coming to work.
Don, are you saying that this sound was striking enough that you heard it before you
Absolutely.
saw it?
I noticed it before the explosion. I noticed a sound like something was very low and shrieking across the sky. And then I heard the explosion.
And which of the two towers is this? Because, again, we're just seeing an angle that's a little deceptive.
This is the West Tower.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're hearing somewhat faintly in the background, Don, as you talk to us, sirens. Are there a lot of emergency vehicles already on the scene?
Yeah, they're descending. This part of New York City has quite a few emergency stations all over, and I imagine it sounds like they're coming from every one of the stations. In fact, there's one just down the street that sounds like every truck they have is headed that way.
We see, actually, we see two faces. I know you can't see the picture that our audience is seeing, but we see two faces of that tower. One seems to have a rather gaping large hole in it. The other face seems to have two holes in it. It's all somewhat obscured by smoke, one large, one somewhat smaller.
Right.
And, of course, we know there are a variety of offices there. There are financial offices there. There are advertising offices, all kinds. We can only hope that since it is still a little bit early in New York, that maybe on some of those floors, some of the offices were still not open for business.
You can now see there on that one side, well, you can see flames now coming actually out of two sides of the building, and I'm minimizing actually the number of openings that are on those two faces of the World Trade Center. There's multiple, it looks like, holes
with fire
or openings
still going on.
On both sides of the tower.
As we've heard before, we said earlier that there was at least one speculative report that an airplane had crashed in, whether deliberately or accidentally, we don't know. And there are continuing reports from people who say that they saw an airplane, one woman saying that she saw a jet going in. So again, Don, a jet screaming that low could be consistent with what you heard?
Absolutely. It could be consistent with what I heard. What I know I did not hear was an airplane, any kind of a prop plane. And I think looking at the damage, I don't think there's any way possible that it would have been a prop plane. It's just too much damage to the building. What's deceptive about the World Trade Center is that it is so huge and so tall that the perspective is difficult to get from the ground. But when you look at the size of the hole, and if you look in context at one of the helicopters going around at a lower size, a helicopter is about the size of a regular Cessna, that kind of thing, the body of the plane. The hole is so much larger than that helicopter that it would have to, if it was a jet, I would have to speculate that it would have to be a larger than normal jet. I mean, larger than like a Citation or something like that. It's just such a gigantic hole, and it blew out the other side. And again, these buildings are almost a city block size building. So for it to have blown this hole on the north side as well as the west side, it had to be a gigantic explosion.
Well, obviously we don't know if it was a plane, and I underline if it was. We don't know if it would have been deliberate or accidental. We know so little now other than what we can see from these pictures. But the interesting point is there are a number of small airports around New York where passenger corporate jets or private jets will land and take off. And it's not uncommon, if you have ever visited the World Trade Center, when you go up to the observation platforms at the top, you can look down on airplanes that are either coming in for landings or taking off from New York airports. But all pilots who fly in this area know very well where the World Trade Center is located. All the routes are very far or comfortably far away from the two towers.
And not just private planes, too, because with some winds in some directions, even out of the big commercial airports, planes are routed quite close to New York. I've flown in from LaGuardia, even into LaGuardia, but having to go right by the World Trade Centers.
But we emphasize this is all speculative at this point. And just to reset for all of you, this is a special report from ABC News, and we are dealing, and we have to underline this, we are dealing purely in the realm of speculation here as to what may have happened at the World Trade Center. Obviously, a major incident occurred here on the upper floors of one of the World Trade Center towers. You can see multiple openings and flames coming out of at least two sides of the tower at the World Trade Center. And
we just got a report that the Associated Press is now reporting that it was an aircraft. So that's one more witness weighing in, or at least one more source weighing in on the fact that it was an aircraft of some kind.
And as Don Daler reported, this occurred about 15 or 20 minutes ago in downtown New York. And New York time, that would have been about 20 minutes or 8:45. This is a time when literally tens of thousands of people are coming to work at the World Trade Center.
Looking at the top of the building, you mentioned there's an observation center, and I don't know what time it opens, but I think it opens fairly early, and people are up there at all hours of the day. Families, tourists coming in to look at the city of New York from atop it. Also there, I don't know if this is the building that has the restaurant on top of it as well, but in those high floors, there are places where tourists team in the morning, even if the regular workers weren't in. And we remind you again that there was a terrorist bomb that did go off at the World Trade Center years ago. It was down in the garage level, but we have no
Obviously
reason,
no
as we say
indication
over
that
and
this
over
could have
again,
been related to
speculate
that.
in that way.
Right.
Now,
Don Daler, ABC's Don Daler, who is on the scene. Don, just give me some description again of what you can see now.
What we're seeing, it appears that there is more and more fire and smoke enveloping the very top of the building. And as fire crews are descending on this area, it does not appear that there's any kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
oh my God.
That looks like a second plane.
Dear
As
Lord.
just
I did not see a plane go in. That just exploded.
We just saw another plane coming in from the side.
You did. I did. That was absorbed
Yes,
by
and
my
that's
view.
the second explosion. You could see the plane come in just from the right-hand side of the screen. So this looks like it is some sort of a concerted effort to attack the World Trade Center that is underway in downtown New York.
We will see that scene again just to make sure we saw what we thought.
We're going to give you a replay of what we just saw, and I must admit I thought it was some sort of fire equipment coming in or some sort of observation plane, but it was obviously designed to attack the World Trade Center. We're going to show you that. Here's a replay of the videotape. In a second, that looks like a good-sized plane came in and hit the World Trade Center from the other side. So this is obviously, or would seem to be, and again, I'm dealing in speculation, but it would seem like there is a concerted attack against one of the towers of the World Trade Center underway.
We had seen a plane coming in from the other direction earlier. I noticed it. Had you, Charlie? I didn't know if it was that plane that then circled wide and came back from another direction, but we all watched it, and I just assumed
Don,
that
could you hear that? Could you hear that plane as it came in?
I did not hear that plane, but I had to step inside the window because the fire crews were so loud, the sirens, that I couldn't hear you.
I got you.
I did see the explosion, but the side of the building that the plane entered was just outside of my view. So all I saw was this huge fireball and the explosion.
Well, the shot that we've got is now just from one side of the World Trade Center. But this is the shot again. This is moments ago of this second plane coming in, and this is now in slow motion. Oh, this is terrifying. Awful.
To watch powerless is a horror.
They waited for the coverage. They waited for the coverage.
All right, we're going to go back to live coverage. Now you're looking at live pictures, and there is the second fire, which was brought about by this second plane that hit the tower. And Don, from everything I can see, it was the same tower that was hit the first time, right?
No, it's the second tower.
It's the other tower.
It is the other tower that was hit.
My mistake.
They targeted it, from what I'm seeing on the television, from your view, the two towers are in, one is in front of the other one, but it was definitely the second tower that was hit about halfway down, not quite as high. And from my view here, it does not seem to be as big, as much damage as the original. I don't know if that means it was not as big a plane or what. I did not see the plane go in, but it's horrendous damage, but it doesn't seem to be the gaping hole through two sides of the building like on the first one.
Don, from your vantage point, can you see if there are people coming out down below?
I can't see the bottom of the base of the buildings.
There's the wider shot of the two towers. Now, both towers have been hit by planes now in the last half hour, and again, I say we are totally powerless in knowing what's going on here, except that it would obviously appear, it can't be a coincidence like this, it would obviously be some sort of a concerted attack against both towers of the World Trade Center. This is again, we're going to show for the third time this tape of the airplane flying in and hitting the World Trade Center. This is slow motion of the plane coming in and hitting the obscured second tower of the World Trade Center. And you can see flame coming out, and I can't see the plane coming down. You know, if it just
Charlie, that's a commercial-sized jet. That did not look like.
No, that's a good-sized airplane. Yes.
Yeah, that's not a little commuter plane. That was a good-sized jet.
And I can't tell if it actually flew into the building or if it just clipped it with a wing. And if it did, of course, then there's the frightening prospect that the plane would have crashed right on the streets of very busy streets of New York.
Yeah.
It seems, and this is a small hope, that the fire may have gone out from the first site. I don't know if we can get the camera in close, but it doesn't mean that the smoke isn't still terrifying and deadly.
Diane, I can see from here the orange flames. The fire has not gone out. In fact, it looks as if it's encompassing a part of the building that was not initially part of the original explosion. I can see it moving over to the left side, which would be the east side of the first building, almost all the way over to the edge. The back side is totally enveloped in flames that I can see from here.
Yes, with that kind of smoke, there's got to be an awful lot of flame in there. And I think all of us have thought at one point or another about the fact that these buildings, though they are so majestic as they stand above the skyline of New York, that it's very difficult for emergency workers or firefighters to fight these. We have a witness who was called in to speak to us. His name is Karim Haroki. Mr. Haroki, did you, as I understand, they're telling me in my ear, is it true that you witnessed the first plane hit the tower?
Yeah.
Could you give me some sort of a description of it?
I was sitting in my car here in Greenwich, you know. I just saw the plane is coming down from the left side and going straight to the building, you know, and going inside.
It actually went inside the building?
Excuse me?
It flew right into the building?
I saw it coming from the left, and I saw the plane coming through to the building. I go inside. It's a small plane.
You say small plane. Was it a jet?
Excuse me?
Was it a jet plane?
No, it was plane, you know, like they teach the people for the plane is like small plane, you know. It's that kind of plane.
You mean like a small single or double engine
yeah, double
plane.
engine, yeah.
Right, and it actually went into the building there on the upper floor.
Yeah, going into the building. And I never saw that plane before. It's like something, I don't know, it's like they work with the motor. I never saw a plane like that before. Yeah.
All
she
right,
works my car, she's nice.
Mr. Haroki, you are down in that area right now then?
Yeah, I'm in Greenwich here on Northmore Street.
Can you tell if there's a large number of fire equipment and emergency equipment on the scene?
Excuse me?
Can you see fire equipment or emergency equipment on the scene?
I don't know. The fire is upstairs in the building, and the second plane is where the other building is.
And did you see the second plane come in?
Yeah, I saw the second plane is go boom. I heard it, you know. I just wake up my head like that. I saw it inside too.
And that second plane much larger than the first?
Same. It's same. Both same.
They're both the same?
Yeah.
Because the pictures we see, the second plane looks rather large.
No, it's not. It's going inside too. It's going inside of the building too. And the second hole, it's smaller than the other one.
And it actually also penetrated the building. You could see it go in.
Yeah, it's inside. It's inside. It's inside. No plane is outside. Nothing.
Now, can you see if there are people fleeing the building? We don't have shots yet from street level. Can you see if there are people leaving the building?
No, I can't see because I told you on the Northmore and Greenwich, I just saw up the building. I can't see downstairs.
So you're in Greenwich Village?
Yeah, no, in Greenwich Street and Northmore.
Oh, I see, on Greenwich Street. Okay, I can. That's just to locate people who don't know New York. That is right in the vicinity, right nearby, but not actually on the site of the World Trade Centers. ABC's Peter Jennings is at the anchor desk uptown here in New York and is now in position. Peter, I suspect you are looking at exactly the same pictures. Well, I know you're looking at the same pictures we are.
We are, Charlie. Been watching it it from the beginning. We'll be watching this for much of the day. There is chaos in New York at the moment. There have been not one but two incidents, as Charlie and Diane have so ably reported so far. The second one coming at 9:03 when television was on live and you could see what was clearly a jet aircraft flying into the second trade tower. Both trade towers now, these 110-story high towers, have now been hit. There is chaos here, or there's chaos in the immediate area. There is confusion in Washington, because now everybody is engaged in this. The Pentagon is involved in this. All the intelligence services are engaged at this in the morning. And as we look at those towers, let's just simply keep looking at these towers this morning. And if you have the feed at home, I actually don't have it here, so somebody could please make sure that I have a picture of what's going on. The various airports in the area, Newark and LaGuardia particularly, have already suspended operations. The city asked the Federal Aviation Administration for permission to close down airspace in all of New York, lest there be a third aircraft or some other untoward incident involved. And ABC's John Miller is with me here, who's been listening efficiently to all of his police sources. And John, I gather the city is ordering a major evacuation from a number of public buildings and a number of these very high-profile targets.
They're going into what they call an Archangel operation, which is a code name for essentially a major lockdown of the city, evacuating the United Nations building, the municipal building, City Hall, Gracie Mansion, which is the mayor's residence, all things that could be considered of this with two incidents. There is the potential that this is a double act of terrorism, and they are worried about other targets.
All right, let's go back to the building itself. John, you work at police radio, if you would, for just a minute. The FBI is already investigating reports that a plane was actually hijacked before this collision, this incident, this attack occurred at the World Trade Towers. In Washington at the moment, the presumption is that this is a terrorist attack, according to ABC's John McWethy, though it's very difficult at the moment for anybody to get a clear appreciation of what has actually happened, because it has happened so quickly. First attack coming just before 9 o'clock Eastern Time, and the second attack, which we could all watch, those of us who are watching television, occurring at 9:03, just 3 minutes after. The president is in Florida, and he has already been told of what is happening. These trade towers have always been, and you may have heard it already this morning, regarded as a prime target for this particular act of terrorism. As you know, there was terrorism at the World Trade Center before 1993. There was a huge bombing attack on the trade centers. These are the two at the southwestern corner of the island of Manhattan, just prime pieces of real estate of interest to anyone who wishes to hit either New York City or the United States in a very, very visible and vulnerable way. We have with us at the moment Lindsey Grimm, a witness who was in the building on the phone. Lindsey, can you hear me?
I hear you.
Can you tell me what you know?
Well, I actually, just to clear things up, I wasn't in the building. I was in the World Financial Center, which is directly behind it.
Okay.
And our part of the building faces the section, the courtyard where the World Trade Center is. So we ran to the window right after we felt this kind of sonic boom as if it were an earthquake, and something just wasn't right. We ran to the window and somebody yelled, "Oh my God, a plane just flew into the World Trade Center."
Is this what we think of as the first one or the second one, Lindsey?
It was the first one, because I was actually outside for the second one.
And the first one appears to have gone into the southern tower, am I correct?
Correct.
And the second one, did you see the second one?
I had my back facing. I was running as fast as well, not running, but walking at a brisk pace away from the two buildings when I heard it, and people just started screaming and running.
Now, you know the area fairly well working down there. Is 9 o'clock in the morning the time when people have gathered in very large number? People get there earlier, get there later?
Yeah, I actually just happened. I usually get here a little after 9, and I happen to be here early for a meeting this morning. So, yeah, I mean, you see the general amount of traffic about 9 o'clock. Is that when it happened, right at 9?
No, just before and just after 9.
Okay.
In that there have been two. Can you see outside at the moment as to anything that's happening?
I am outside.
And where are you and what are you seeing?
I am west of the two buildings, looking directly at them, and it's difficult to look at. I'll tell you that much.
This is not an area which is easy to reach for emergency services. These two buildings hug the Hudson River. There's only the West Side Drive that comes up there. Is there a large amount of emergency equipment descending on the place?
There sure is. As soon as I got out of the building, so obviously the first thing you're surrounded by is siren noise everywhere, and you can hear it coming by now, even still.
Anything else you know that you'd like to add?
Just as I was coming out of the building, I heard somebody sort of ushering people away, and they were saying, you guys got to get out of here, it's a bomb.
Many thanks, Lindsey Grimm, who saw this occurring, at least the first, hesitate to call it an attack. The first incident, we'll continue to call it for now, and very much the second one now. That's what it looks like. Both of the towers in the Twin Trade Towers are now on fire. We have no idea whatsoever the measure of casualties inside or the measure of damage inside, though you can only imagine it. The New York City Office of Emergency Management said to us a short while ago they do not know what happened yet. Want to check in very quickly with the President of the United States, John Cochrane, who was the President in Florida. John?
Peter, as you know, the President's down in Florida talking about education. He got up at his hotel suite this morning, was about to leave. Reporters saw the White House Chief of Staff, Andy Card, whisper into his ear. Then reporters said to the President, do you know what's going on in New York? He said he did, and said he will have something to say about it later. His first event is about a half an hour at an elementary school in Sarasota, Florida.
Thanks, John. John Cochrane with the President. President's in Florida today pushing his education reform. It will get wiped off the agenda today in view of this extraordinarily serious accident. For those of you who don't know, the Twin Trade Towers, and it's a popular destination for tourists when they come to New York City. It has financial offices in it. It has government offices. It has lots of access on the top, above where this incident actually occurred, where tourists come. It's one of the great views in New York City, and people gather there, certainly at the foot of the building, fairly early in the morning, to be able to go and see it. The two collisions, the two incidents have occurred about 2/3 of the way up. John Miller, we haven't, we haven't had an aircraft fly into a building in New York, as far as I know, since just after the Second World War, when
The Empire State Building.
When it flew to the Empire State Building.
That's right. A B-52 flew into the Empire State Building then, and this is really the first time there's been anything like that since.
John, I was listening as you and Chris Isham, the head of our investigative unit, wandered up here to the rim just a short while ago to saying, one of you, I think, this is something they've been waiting to happen. Who are you talking about? What are you talking about?
What we were talking about is there's been a great frustration since the bombing of the World Trade Center, which the suspects later told federal authorities were intended to take the building down, that it didn't have a larger effect. And U.S. intelligence, FBI people for years have heard that they've always wanted to try and finish that job off, to take the buildings out, and that it was another viable target. Interestingly, ironically, whatever you want to call it, the World Trade Center just hired 2 weeks ago the head of the FBI's National Security Division for Counterterrorism in New York to augment and take over their security, pretty much aware of the level of threat that this is as a symbolic target.
One of the things that anybody mounting security in the World Trade Center himself will not be able to necessarily appreciate is what has happened at some distance. And there are a couple of reports, speculative at the moment, drifting around, including one on the Associated Press, which says the FBI is investigating reports of a plane hijacking just before the World Trade Center actually crashed. And John McCarthy, our national security correspondent, is with us in Washington. John, what do you know?
Peter, we do hear that there was a hijacking. It is not clear where that hijacking occurred at this point, but it is one of the many things that U.S. officials are scrambling to try to get a handle on at this point.
Anything else, John? What happens at the Pentagon at a moment like this? I know everybody springs into action, but what do?
What happens is there is a particular counterterrorism cell within the Joint Chiefs of Staff that goes into an emergency basis at this point. They're investigating all aspects of air traffic in the area, all intelligence that, as they sift through it, may have given them some indication that something was happening. At this point, though, there were no warnings, they say, this morning. As they go back through this information, they may cull through it and find some clue, but at this point they believe there is no warning.
Thank you very much, John, which would please call us back as soon as you have something which would call into question immediately, of course, the notion of counterterrorism in an incident like this. Now, nobody who's watching television, watching Good Morning America today, for example, saw, at least those of us working on television, saw a first plane crash into the building. Much of the country watching television this morning will have seen the second plane crash into the other tower. And we have, as you can see from a distance there, until we get our cameras on the ground, producing material which we can put on the air, a pretty limited view. So we have no idea what the evacuation procedure is in the building. We do know...
Difficult. We're listening in the background. At this time, all elevators are out in both towers, according to the rescue workers on the scene. They put out an urgent call for Scott air packs because they're climbing smoke-filled stairwells. They've got to go very high up to get to the target locations, and they're talking about people trapped in the smoke there.
And this, of course, is reminiscent of 1993 when the explosions occurred at the trade towers last time.
Exactly.
John, is it standard operating procedure? You mentioned that all of the other principal government buildings in the city, Gracie Mansion, the mayor's official residence, and some of the other buildings will be evacuated. Is that a fairly standard anticipated operation?
It is an existing plan that is on paper, but Peter, I have to say it's never been put into effect in New York. This is unprecedented, and I think as this develops, you'll see similar plans go into effect in Washington and potential target buildings, because they really have to take the position that they're under some form of attack here, at least as a precaution, until they sort this out.
As we wait to get a better grasp of what now becomes a rescue operation of the people in between trade towers, we're reminded here that the U.S. officials, according to Pentagon sources, have no warnings today of any kind of terrorist attack. And if you listen to the news on a regular basis, you hear the Pentagon warning Americans worldwide of some impending terrorist attack. And here we are in the height of commercial America, with no warning whatsoever, no intelligence whatsoever, as far as we can tell, at least in these first couple of hours.
No, and all of the latest intelligence, at least the basics of which I've been scanning for months, have focused on the high potential for attacks against American targets abroad. Indeed, federal authorities and the intelligence community have reported they've interdicted and interrupted more than a dozen of those attacks by shutting terrorist cells down around the world. They've always been worried since the first attack on the World Trade Center that there would be another bold strike on U.S. soil.
And of course there are any number of targets which have been high on counterintelligence's list in New York City: the Lincoln Tunnel, the United Nations, the Holland Tunnel, the FBI headquarters, not to mention all of the city civic buildings which John mentions. President Bush is, by the way, going to speak very shortly to the nation about this, and then he's going to return to Washington. And we have on the phone our principal aviation analyst and expert, John Nance. Good morning, John.
Morning, Peter.
What would you like to contribute to this? Because one knows that it is indeed possible to fly an aircraft into a building if one intends to do so.
If one intends to do so, that's correct. And unfortunately, when you've got something that has been as worrisome a target as the World Trade Center, regardless of the way we've hardened it up on the ground, they have apparently, whoever they is, picked the one vulnerable area. The thing that is most disturbing to me is not only the fact, of course, that there are people more than likely in that building that have been directly affected by this, but that we may have an innocent load of passengers. The flash of that second aircraft across the screen is disturbingly close to what you would call the plan form of an Airbus A319 or an Airbus 320, also of a 767 or something of that nature. And that's a large airplane.
John, let me go slowly with you, and we'll actually put it on the screen again, very slowly, so that we can see it come across screen. Are you able to identify specifically the type of aircraft by looking at this videotape as it comes across? Can we roll that, please?
I'm watching that right as it comes across the screen, and it is more than likely not a Boeing 737. That profile, Peter, is very close to an Airbus A320, A319.
And who flies the Airbus 320, 318?
We have quite a few airlines.
Okay, so
very few private ones.
All right, and John comports a little bit here with at least these initial reports that the FBI is investigating reports of a hijacking just before the second crash occurred. We had no... John, let me just ask you one other technical question about just flying in the World Trade Centers. When the first incident occurred, it was reasonable for people to suspect that that was an accident.
Yes.
From a flying point of view, is the World Trade Center always something to worry about if you're taking off from one of New York City's airports?
Not really. And the fact that we have had all these years since that B-25 crashed into the Empire State Building tells you a lot about the flight paths around New York City. You have to be so disastrously out of contact and off course, and so many things would have to go wrong to imperil any of the buildings in Manhattan. The fact that it hasn't happened tells us really how rare a situation it would have to be.
John, the FAA immediately asked for New York City airports to suspend operations. We can confirm that Newark and LaGuardia have closed down.
And Kennedy and Teterboro and Westchester. Yes. They've essentially asked all airports within a 20-mile radius to put a hold on anything taken off.
Teterboro Airport, which is in New Jersey, just on the west side of the Hudson River, and Westchester, which is maybe 40, 50 miles north of New York City. They're all suspended operations. Standard, easy to do, John, quick to do, it seems to have been so.
Fortunately, very, very quick to do because they're all controlled by air traffic control towers, and they can put a halt to the operations with one phone call.
Okay, John Nance, thanks very much. Call us back, will you, if you learn anything.
Peter, one of the difficulties they're going to face, as you can glean from this picture here, is the people who are trapped need to be rescued are on the upper floors, but you see the plume of smoke covers the roof. The last explosion was at the bottom of the building and the smoke rose up, but they were able to make a series of daring rescues by landing, and they've trained for this and retrained, landing police helicopters on the roofs of the Twin Towers and pulling people out. It's going to be very difficult, since the roofs are now enveloped in smoke, for the police helicopters, which are arriving at a landing zone now, just below the World Trade Center, to be able to get up there till that smoke dissipates. And that's where they had expected to pull a lot of people out this time because they had so much success the last time.
Similarly, John, if you look at the two buildings, it does appear that at least in the northern tower there, or the left tower, as you see it on the screen, below the incident, the building at least looks on the outside to be reasonably secure, and people will have a long, horrendous, terrifying walk down in a darkened building, but will at least be able to get out on the ground. By the way, Claire Shipman, ABC's Claire Shipman just called in. She's been checking with the FBI. She also says that the FBI had no warning whatsoever. Their crisis management operation in Washington is in place in conjunction with the Federal Aviation Administration. They are all now, which makes perfect sense, focusing on the recovery of survivors. The New York Stock Exchange has delayed indefinitely its opening today. This will just have not only an extraordinary effect on the national psyche, one surmises, dissimilar perhaps, but from what happened in Oklahoma City, but a very clear reminder to those of us in the United States that terrorism of a huge magnitude, with which we're somewhat more accustomed in the Middle East and in Africa, given the attacks on the U.S. embassies a couple of summers ago. But a reminder again that as far as international terrorism is concerned, and people's anger and even desperation on this occasion with the United States is going to find itself manifest here on U.S. soil. Here's the president now in Florida. I wonder if everybody knows there what's going on. We'll listen to him.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a difficult moment for America. I unfortunately will be going back to Washington after my remarks. Secretary Broad-Pace and Lieutenant Governor will take the podium and discuss education. I do want to thank the folks here at Booker Elementary School for their hospitality. Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence. May God bless the victims, their families, and America. Thank you very much.
President clearly shaken, I think one can say, confirming what we think we all knew, which was the two aircraft in an act of terrorism crashed into the twin trade towers. Nobody was quite certain about the first one at the very outset, but the president absolutely, having talked to the vice president, the governor of New York, the director of the FBI, now believing and confirming that we have two terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, and the president saying the two things which a president must say at a moment like this: terrorism will not stand, which is an important thing for him to say, but not always necessarily effective, and God bless the victims and their families. John Miller, what are you picking up on the police radio?
There was a bit of a stir a moment ago because LaGuardia Tower reported urgently that there was another aircraft moving fast in the no-fly zone. Now they've contacted that aircraft and they say it's a military aircraft that's rushed to the scene to enforce the no-fly zone and literally be a presence in the area in case there is another plane headed for the building. So there'll be some at least armed aircraft up to confront it.
Just think for a second, John, how you have drawn an extraordinary parallel. We think of no-fly zones as being in southern
Iraq
and northern Iraq, where the Iraqis are not allowed to fly, and if they do fly, are going to be shot down. Now we have a no-fly zone all around the lower part of New York City, and perhaps on the northern area too. All of the areas, airports closed down, and armed American aircraft in the air to shoot down anybody else who wants to take a shot at the place.
I mean, those are the reports that are coming across the radio now, and if they're true, it's quite incredible and certainly unprecedented.
Well, it would also suggest, as best you can tell, looking at it from this very sort of antiseptic environment that we are all in our newsrooms, is that the reaction has been fairly quick. New York City has an Office of Emergency Management. It's over here on the west side. It's a great bunker. Which the city,
ironically, it's located in the World Trade Center complex, although not in the Twin Towers.
Just
right
north
next door,
north of the trade towers,
right.
in the World Trade Center, in the other northern World Trade Center there. And on an occasion like this is not one they absolutely anticipate when they got going. They're talking very concerned with chemical and biological warfare. They've got extensive plans about that, which they very often demonstrate to the press. I'm going to interrupt myself and everybody else for a second because one of our senior producers, Mark Obenhaus, is on the phone, and he saw the incident. Mark, do you hear me?
I do indeed, Peter.
Go ahead.
Well, I was leaving my house to go to work, and I walked down the street to go to the subway. I was at the corner of Franklin and West Broadway, and as I was approaching the subway, a tremendous roar went over my head, and I looked up immediately, and it was a plane, and much lower than I've ever seen a plane in Lower Manhattan. And it was a large plane. I couldn't identify it as anything specific except that it was a commercial jet, certainly. And then my eye followed it because this is approximately 15 blocks from the World Trade Center, and it just slammed right into it and was completely engulfed by the building. It was extraordinary. No wings flew off, nothing like that. It just went directly in, creating this sort of cavern-like hole, and suddenly then big flames started protruding from it, and then of course smoke, and then debris started just catapulting. And of course the area that we're in, there's a great deal of foot traffic, and people are just approaching and beginning to just gasp at just the sight of the building itself. Even if they hadn't seen it, the actual incident, the actual impact, just the sight of this huge building engulfed in flame with a massive cavernous hole in the side of it. And we stood there, I can't tell you the amount of time, I would estimate about 15 minutes. And of course there's all kinds of services coming down, fire department and so forth. And then suddenly from my vantage point, which would be north of the building, the far tower suddenly explodes in flames. yet again, a similar kind of an event. And I now see, I've run down the street to my home where I have the television on, and I saw that too was another airplane. From our vantage point, you couldn't tell what exactly it was that hit the second tower, but it was a similar, seemingly almost like bomb blast, and with flames and debris protruding wildly from the building.
Mark, let me ask you a couple of more specific questions. You now confirmed for us, I think, that it was the first attack on the tower that you saw.
Yes.
What direction was the aircraft coming from?
It was coming from the north.
It was coming from north down over Manhattan itself?
Yes. It would have been flying roughly over the west side. I'm on, as they say, West Broadway, which is probably a quarter mile from the river. So it was on a direct path north, from the north, into the north tower.
Do you remember whether it had 2 engines, 3 engines, or 4 engines?
I do not. It was very quick. It struck me, the profile, the body of the plane was of such scale that I immediately identified it as a commercial jet. It happened so quickly I couldn't tell whether it had windows on the side or what. It could very well have been some sort of a transport plane, but it was a large plane. As opposed to occasionally down here you do see smaller prop planes or smaller aviation stuff that flies around here, sometimes doing movies and things like that. But in all my years down here, and I've lived down here for about 20 years within walking distance easily of the building, I've never heard anything like this, and that's why I just immediately glanced up and just followed the track of this sound and this huge plane that was swooping over my head.
Could you see any marking on it whatsoever?
No, I did not. It was too quick. I can't give you any kind of identifying help on what it was.
Do you remember what color it was?
My impression was that it had a tan coloration to it. However, the sun, it was very low in the horizon, and I think kind of orange, and it may have been simply the color of the sun reflecting off a silver exterior. I really am not sure of that.
Okay, Mark. Anything else? What's the mood in the environment down there at the moment? As if it's not hard to mention.
Everyone who glimpses it close up, it's quite different seeing it from the ground than on these television pictures that I'm now looking at, because it's close to you and you see what the impact must have been like, and you see the kind of devastation that has incurred by the buildings, and it's just frightening is perhaps even too mild a word.
Okay.
It's absolutely just a horrible sight. It reminds you of the worst kind of effects in movies that you're reassured watching a movie that it's an effect, but this is not.
Well, Mark, you and I were supposed to have a meeting not long from now. We'd prefer you to go and work the story if you would, and call us back as soon as you can.
I will indeed.
Many thanks. Mark Obenhaus, one of our senior producers on the phone, who saw the incident, describes it as a large plane, not sure what the color was, not sure the number of engines it had, which in his mind, he's a very experienced reporter, reflects the speed and surprise with which this aircraft, this is the first one we're talking about now, just before 9 o'clock, approached the World Trade Towers from the north, causing the first huge gap in the building. And Mark describes the plane being engulfed in some respects by the building. Didn't see wings fall off, saw it go absolutely, totally almost as he described it, into the building itself. And we now have had one of the enormous difficulties about terrorism, everybody knows, is that you almost immediately get a claim of responsibility, and you may get several, and people's suspicions get ramped up given the obvious nature of people who they think or know are involved in terrorism around the world. There has been a claim of responsibility, according to the Reuters news agency, made to Abu Dhabi television in the Persian Gulf from something called the Palestinian DFLP. The Palestinian DFLP is something called the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. It has been for many, many years one of the most militant of the Palestinian organizations, has been involved in violence before, has been involved in other actions before, and it is the first organization to claim responsibility for this, though we have to caution you in all the obvious ways that before the day is over, there may be any number of people who claim responsibility. The White House, of course, has leapt to the forefront of people's concern this morning, and there is a plane circling the White House at the moment, and they're clearing the grounds there. We have a report which may be misleading in that it may presume an attack, whereas we just discovered a moment ago that what we had with an additional airplane in New York airspace was a security operation. I think probably most Americans know that there is no building in the country which has heavily defended, I shouldn't say deemed secure, but a battery of anti-aircraft missiles on the top of the White House itself. We've had an incident, as you know, in the past, several years ago, where a small aircraft landed in the White House garden, and the pilot, mentally deranged, as I recall at the time, was killed. But the White House is certainly been very heavily defended, and this plane circling the White House adds to the trauma that people are feeling today, but we have no idea precisely what that means. John Miller, you're listening.
The scene is still in some degree of chaos, but the police have set up a major mobilization point just outside the building, and they've set up a tactical mobilization point. The major mobilization point is for the responding units involved in the rescue. The tactical one is actually an armed mobilization point for security outside the World Trade Center now.
Thanks very much. Let's go to the White House. Claire Shipman is on the phone. Claire, what's that we're looking at?
Well, that's what we're trying to figure out right now. All we know is it's a gigantic plume of smoke coming from behind the old executive office building, and we're told that the White House itself, the West Wing, at the very least is being evacuated, that our personnel from there are being asked to leave. We've sent people running over there to try to find out what it is, but we don't know yet.
Now, the old executive office building is slightly to the west and a fraction to the south. So we are looking southwest from a camera just across Lafayette Park, which is north of the White House. The White House is to the left side, out of your picture. Maybe even the cameraman could give us some appreciation. But you have no idea. Was that an explosion? Did you hear anything?
We did not hear it. In fact, we were trying to figure out from the White House what security precautions they were taking around the White House in the wake of the apparent attacks on the World Trade Center, and we suddenly just saw the smoke rising from behind the old executive office building. We have people on their way there now, but it's like nothing I've ever seen. I mean, we've never seen that kind of smoke coming from anything that would ordinarily occur here.
I must also tell you, Claire, I think if you think about what's behind the EOB there, you're really down in pretty open area. It doesn't look like a place where a building would be on fire.
No, that's right, although there are a number of buildings just behind the old executive office building on G Street that could potentially be on fire, but nothing you would necessarily think of as a target. Apparently, we're also...
Claire, let me interrupt you for a second. We now have fire confirmed at the Pentagon. John McCarthy at the Pentagon can hear me. John, please get in touch immediately if you can and brief us in there. John McCarthy has actually been evacuated from the Pentagon, and parts of the Pentagon are indeed being evacuated. We want to hold our breath here, it just seems to me, for a second, and not get into a mode that the country is under attack. But we now have 2 attacks on the Twin Trade Tower Center. U.S. buildings, city buildings completely evacuated in New York City. We have this mysterious black smoke at the southwest corner of the White House, which is to say there's something going on behind the old executive office building. We now have a report that fire has been confirmed at the Pentagon. ABC's John McCarthy, our Pentagon correspondent, who's been plugging in as quickly to the intelligence and counterintelligence units there this morning, has been temporarily evacuated. But that is as much as we know for sure at the moment. John Miller, go back to what you're hearing on your nets.
Actually, it's interesting. In New York City, they're reporting on what we're seeing here also, essentially trying to tell everybody that heightened security is important now.
John, I apologize. There's a lot of us here. What are we listening to there? Say again. Say again, please. Come here, John.
Reporting that bomb squads are checking out Air Force One.
Good. Great. So we have bomb squads.
I think you're going to see a lot of this, and I think we were talking about this a few minutes ago. In fact, when I was telling you that in New York they were evacuating the municipal building, the United Nations, Gracie Mansion, which is the mayor's residence, all potential targets, I suggested to you that shortly in Washington you'll probably be seeing the same kind of reaction at sensitive symbolic locations, and apparently that's become more than a concern, but perhaps a reality.
Okay, we do know, or at least the Associated Press is now reporting, that an aircraft crashed near the Pentagon, and the West Wing of the White House, as Claire Shipman told us, was evacuated amid these threats of terrorism. I guess first of all, let me go to another eyewitness. ABC's Bill Blakemore, one of our senior reporters, has been an eyewitness to the New York incident. Billy, on the phone?
Yes, I am, Peter.
Go ahead.
I'm down at 12th Street. It looks like we're more than a mile north of this very surrealistic site, and business has completely come to a stop here. Looks like throughout lower Manhattan, people standing in the streets, cell phones aren't working. A few of these phone booths, such as I'm talking to you from now, are working. One man, just shaking his head, said to me a few moments ago, I was supposed to be at a meeting in the building at 10:30 this morning, and then I saw the second plane hit the tower and this flash of light. There's a complete cessation of regular life. There's one delivery man standing here looking like he doesn't know where to go with this stack of beer crates. So all of lower Manhattan is just standing in the streets on this sunny morning looking at this unrealistic sight in front of us, this gray smoke coming out of the Trade Center.
Okay, Bill, talk to as many people as you can. Call us back when you can.
I want to let you know we're going to get back to ABC's special coverage, but we ourselves, what started in New York is now happening in Washington. We want to get more into that this morning.
That's right. I'm Carol Costello. Don Hudson. We want to go live to Sam Ford right now. He is live at Reagan National Airport with an update on the air crash at the Pentagon. Sam Ford, tell us what you can.
Well, Carol, as you can see, there's this huge cloud of smoke behind me, and that is the location of the Pentagon. We had come here to National Airport to, continue our coverage of the situation in New York because the airports had been shut down. No sooner had we gotten here and stopped the car than we looked up, and there was this cloud of smoke billowing from the Pentagon. There had been a traffic accident here at National, and a number of emergency vehicles were dealing with that. Then suddenly we saw this, and I would say within a couple of minutes they were all tearing out of here, heading toward the Pentagon. We asked folks here. One of the police officers told me that he had heard a plane had gone into the Pentagon. Obviously, more of the situations in New York. People here are extremely nervous, and some are saying that they wanted us to leave this area. We don't know if they're going to shut down the airport or evacuate this place. If this is a concern, at this point, people are still here, but there is concern about the safety of this place, obviously, with these bombs going off or planes crashing into buildings all over the place. But that's it here. As you can see, the smoke, and you can see, paper flying about. Yes, Carol.
Sam, a question for you. We understand that there is a tail section of a plane sticking out of the Pentagon, and a plane did hit the Pentagon. Is that true?
Well, at this point, Carol, we are at National Airport, so all we can really see is the flame. Now, I understand we have some photographers over at the Pentagon. I cannot tell you exactly, but from our vantage point, we see smoke.
Sam, if I can interrupt, we do have an eyewitness who actually saw this event take place. They're on the phone with us now. Is it Mr. or Ms. Gurman?
Mr. Gurman.
Okay, Mr. Gurman, tell us what happened.
I saw a big explosion, a ball of fire. My window rattled, and I looked at it. It was a big ball of fire and the smoke coming out. But I'm looking at it right now. It's missed the Navy Annex. It missed the Pentagon. It's like missed so many high-rise buildings. It hit probably a parking lot, or there's a cemetery behind the Navy Annex.
Mr. Gurman, did you actually see a plane?
I didn't see a plane. I heard the explosion. I thought it was a flyby because I live next to the airport. My window rattled. I looked out. I saw a ball of fire and just smoke coming out.
Are you feeling nervous right now, Mr. Gurman?
Oh, very much so. I thought I was hit. I mean, the building shook so much.
Well, you're not the only one, that's for sure. As we keep you on the phone, and Sam as well, we're now getting reports that the White House has been threatened here. We're also getting reports that Capitol has been evacuated. The West Wing of the White House evacuated to go along with all this. What started at 8:40 this morning, New York, is now threatening, of course, our city, our safety, and a lot of folks
and
very concerned.
The pictures you're looking at right now are from our live cameras. You can see smoke pouring near the Pentagon. Mr. Gurman, do you want to add anything? I can hear you're still on the phone with us.
I'm trying to get out of here because I live a few miles from the Pentagon.
Okay, you get going, Mr. Gurman. We understand. Thank you for joining us. Let's go Let's go to a White House shot that we have right now. The White House West Wing has been evacuated, as we understand. We know that President Bush is not there, but he is on his way back to Washington. You can see the armed guards on top of the White House keeping watch. But at this point, they, as well as we, don't know exactly what's going to happen, but everyone is on standby, as you might expect.
And as you mentioned, in case people are wondering and didn't see President Bush in Florida for an educational issue down there, he made a brief announcement about this and said he was on his way back here to deal with it, and of course saying that the terrorist acts will not be tolerated and that they will be looking into it. But after he made that comment is when it happened at the Pentagon. At that time, only the 2 planes had crashed into the Twin Towers, the World Trade Center in New York.
We wish you could tell you more about what's going on in our own backyard at the Pentagon. We don't know if there were any injuries. We do know there was a construction scene on the scene at the time. We do know when they heard something explode, they turned around and they started to run. We do not know if anyone inside the Pentagon or around it was hurt.
Okay, we have another person on the phone. Janet, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
We understand that you witnessed this plane, a plane crash into the Pentagon?
Yes, sir, I did.
Tell us exactly what you saw.
Well, I live in a high-rise building just outside of Roslyn, and I was actually glued to the television, and I have an office here, and it's all glassed in, and I saw a plane just coming right in front of my window, flying at a path that the commercial planes do not fly. Not coming into the direction to land at National Airport.
How big was the plane?
It certainly looked larger. Every once in a while there's a flight path difference for smaller private planes that come in. This was not a small private-looking plane. It looked more like sort of a commuter-type plane.
And you said
it was sizable, yes.
And then you said it was headed directly to the Pentagon.
Yeah, it was heading in the direction of the airport, and I thought, this plane is way too low, and there's no runway that it goes in that direction, and it didn't turn at all. And I just, as soon as I saw it, I knew it was way too low and not on a flight path that I'd ever seen before living here.
Okay, and what did you hear?
I couldn't hear anything from where I am. I just saw the plane just disappear out of my sight beyond the trees, and then I just saw massive billows of smoke. And then a few minutes later, I heard it was, and it basically is obviously right where the Pentagon is. I can't see the Pentagon; it's covered with trees.
Are you in a safe place right now?
As far as I know, I'm in my apartment where I live, so I am on the 13th floor of a high-rise in Roslyn here.
We can see on the bottom right-hand corner of our screen, you can see the firefighters spraying at the Pentagon, trying to put out that fire. Jan, were you already aware of what happened in New York when you saw this coming?
Yes, sir, I was. I was glued to the television. Because I actually am running an event in New York at the end of the week.
Oh, you poor thing. Okay, we're going to go back to our Sam Ford, who's at Reagan National right now. We understand the FAA has taken some action. Sam, can you tell us what it is?
Yes, Carol. Because of this situation, the FAA has shut down all aircraft flights across the country. I think it is a situation where it is too dangerous. Right here at National Airport, you normally would have planes taking off and landing. There are no planes taking off or landing here. The skies are clear, and there is smoke covering the area. This gentleman is named Todd Nelson. You were just picking up what debris. What is it? Some sort of...
It looks like insulation. I was just standing here watching, and all sorts of paper and debris and insulation.
I'm sorry, yeah. This is what...
All sorts of paper and debris and insulation were just flying down, landing on us over here, and it's just amazing.
Yeah, some sort of insulation or some sort of debris that appears to have come from the Pentagon crash coming through the air. You could see papers flying through the air, things like that. So that's the word from here. We're hearing the FAA has shut down air traffic.
Thank you very much, Sam Ford, reporting to us live from Reagan National. We have another eyewitness on the phone right now. His name is Charles Tanner. Mr. Tanner, tell us what you saw.
I was in the, I live at the Overlook Apartments, and I was doing some exercise, jump roping, and this plane came increasingly fast, almost close enough to, it headed this direction, hit the building that I'm in, which is an 8-story building, but it was aiming for in the direction of the Pentagon, and then all of a sudden I see this puff of smoke, and I just ran over to Columbia to get a better view of it.
So, Charles, you didn't actually see it hit. You just saw it to a point, and then you saw the smoke?
I just saw this plane coming very, very fast, going in that direction as I was listening to you guys talk about what happened at the World Trade Center.
And where you live, obviously, it's close enough to Reagan National, but that's not a flight path you normally see.
Right. Well, I'm closer to the Pentagon than to Reagan National.
Okay, but obviously planes flying over there on a daily basis.
This is usually not the flight path of any aircraft.
Mr. Tanner, we do have more information about exactly where that plane crashed. We understand right now from the AP that it crashed near a helicopter landing pad near the Pentagon. So as far as we know, it didn't crash directly into the Pentagon. From where you are, Mr. Tanner, are you okay? Are you safe?
Well, unless, of course, the plane decides to hit this building, yes, I think I'm very safe.
Can you believe that this is happening in Washington, D.C., Mr. Tanner?
I want to say yes and no, okay, because of different terrorist activities and things of that nature, and because of what happened at the World Trade Center, I would say that it doesn't surprise me. I'm just a little shaken that it has happened.
And I'm not sure when we talk about that helicopter pad, if it's the one that's on the west side where you drive by all the time on the main street, that you can see if there's another one there as well that a lot of folks go by on a daily basis.
We quickly want to recap before we return it to ABC News. The State Department has now been evacuated. The White House has been evacuated. The Capitol has been evacuated. There was a credible threat to the mansion, which I'm talking about the White House here, and so the entire White House has now been evacuated.
Of course, this all started in New York about 8:40. We want to go back to ABC News and allow them to continue their coverage of this entire and unbelievable incident that's going on. I'm Don Hudson along with Carol Costello. We send it now back to ABC News.
Just before 9 o'clock, and the second one was after that. And John Miller, you're listening.
Actually, it's interesting. There's no way to characterize any part of this as fortunate, but if you look at cities who are prepared to handle an incident like this, and as you've seen New York's emergency response to this, it is probably one of the few places that is prepared with the kind of equipment, response, and rescue efforts that could actually address something like this. And Washington is probably the other. Immediately when this happened, the entire emergency service unit, which comprises hundreds of specially trained cops, was mobilized to the scene. Now a triage center for the injured has been set up just around the corner from the World Trade Center. It's an incredible scene down there with a tremendous amount of equipment.
The Federal Aviation Administration has actually gone even further than it did a few minutes ago. It was asking all planes not to take off. Now the FAA has ordered all aircraft currently in the air over the United States to land at the nearest airport. Now you can imagine what may be happening, or what they think might be happening in some part of the country, that there is somebody else on some aircraft coming from somewhere or going somewhere with evil intentions, and so all aircraft currently in the air over the United States have been ordered to land at the nearest airport.
I think what you're going to see...
Hang on a sec, John. I just want to check one thing, because one of the very first people the President talked to was the Director of the FBI, and Pierre Thomas, who covers the Justice Department and the FBI for us, has been here. They may think they prepare for this kind of thing, Pierre, but man, it must have been a shock.
Stunning shock. The FBI Special Operations Center is now in full alert. The FBI extremely concerned that there would be additional attacks. Normally when you have a situation like this, they immediately get on the line with the CIA, the various intelligence agencies, trying to get a sense of who might have been planning something. But right now, the first order of business is to protect against a second attack, third attack. The feeling is normally when you have this kind of situation, there will be more attacks almost immediately.
Let's go to the trade tower again, because, John, we now have what do we have? We don't...
Wow. It looks like a new large plume of smoke.
Now, it may be that something fell off the building. It may be that something has fallen. We don't know, to be perfectly honest. But that is what you're looking at, is the current. That's the scene at this moment at the World Trade Center. Dan Daler from ABC's Good Morning America is down in the general vicinity. Dan, can you tell us what has just happened?
Yes, Peter, it's Don Daler down here. I'm 4 blocks north of the World Trade Center. The second building that was hit by the plane has just completely collapsed. The entire building has just collapsed, as if a demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it folded down on itself, and it is not there anymore.
That should be it.
Thanks very much.
It has completely collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
That's the southern tower you're talking about.
Exactly. The second building that we witnessed the airplane enter had been, the top half had been fully involved, in flame. It just collapsed. There is panic on the streets. Thousands of people running up Church Street, which is what I'm looking out on, trying to get away. But the entire, at least as far as I can see, the top half of the building, at least half of it, I can't see below that, half of it just started with a gigantic rumble, folded in on itself, and collapsed in a huge plume of smoke and dust.
We're talking about massive casualties here at the moment, and we have, that is extraordinary.
There is panic on the streets. There are people screaming and running from the site. The gigantic plume of smoke has reached me, and I'm probably a quarter of a mile north of there.
Peter.
Now this is what it looked like moments ago. My God. The southern tower, 10 o'clock Eastern time this morning, just collapsing on itself. This is a place where thousands of people work. We have no idea what caused this. If you wish to bring anybody who's ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under infrastructure of a building and bring it down.
Peter?
Yes, Dan.
What appeared to happen from my vantage point, the top part of the building was totally involved in fire, and there appeared to be no effort possible to put the fire out. It looked like the top part of the building was so weakened by the fire that the weight of it collapsed the rest of the building. That's what appeared to happen. I did not see anything happening at the base of the building. It all appeared to start at the top and then just collapse the rest of the building by the sheer weight of the top. There was no explosion or anything at the base part of it, but I did see that the top part of it started to collapse. The walls started to bulge out, bricks, glass things coming out, and then it collapsed in on itself, and it appeared to just fold down from there, from the very top.
Thanks, Don, very much. Just looking at that, I don't know why, but when was the last time the United States was attacked in this fashion? It was Pearl Harbor in 1941. John?
From the scene now, there's obviously massive casualties. Usually during these things, there's a little bit of a high pitch, but basic calm over the police radios among the emergency workers. I can hear them screaming, signal 1013, which is the police code for help, calling help at the triage center, where other people who were already injured have been injured more, confirming that the building has collapsed. Dozens of officers, more civilians are injured. And we don't know, although I'd have to suggest, given the size of that building, what progress the evacuation was in of the tower that collapsed.
Yes, Pierre Thomas.
One thing I might add is that in recent years, the U.S. government has been preparing for massive attacks, but it's been primarily focused on biological, often bombing attacks. One of the things I have not heard discussed at all in government circles is the notion someone would hijack a plane and perhaps fly it into a building. So one of the questions that I'm sure that will come out of this, if this indeed is a terrorist attack, is what kind of defenses did the U.S. have in place to deal with an event like this?
Well, we talked about that even, Pierre, just before you came and joined, because at the Emergency Management Center, which is just literally in the same complex as the trade towers, they talk at great length about their preparations for biological, the chemical warfare attack, how they closed tunnels. I mean, they've been very efficient, taken it very seriously for many years. I'd be a little surprised if the notion of an airborne attack on a United States target had not been discussed, but the notion of the intelligence services knowing absolutely nothing of what is going on today and saying openly right away they had no warnings whatsoever is, and you say something very important, if this is a terrorist attack. We just keep saying that on a repeated basis. Not having any notion whatsoever of what's going on is to be reminded not only of the efficiency of terrorism, but just reminded of the efficiency of terrorism.
It's ironic. There's a chilling story. Lou Scalero of the FBI who was part of the capture of Ramzi Youssef, who was the mastermind of the last bombing of the World Trade Center, told me this story, that he was flying over the World Trade Center in a helicopter with the suspect Ramzi Youssef next to him after he was captured in Pakistan. And as they passed over, Lou Shalero nudged him and said to Ramzi Youssef, you see, it's still standing. And Ramzi Youssef smiled and said to the FBI's assistant director, it wouldn't be if I'd had more money. This was...
In other words, more money to buy explosives, more money to run a more efficient operation than the one he ran from New Jersey in '93.
Exactly. And I mean, we may have seen the second coming of that plan.
John McCarthy is on the phone at the Pentagon. Hold up, let me just... John McCarthy, we've now heard reports that 3 planes have been hijacked today. Can you confirm that? Jack McCarthy at the Pentagon? Okay, then let me go quickly to someone named Don Wright, who saw the plane crash into the Pentagon. Don, are you there in Washington?
Yes, I am.
Can you tell us what happened?
Yes, it was about 9:35, and I was looking out our 12th floor windows at 1600 Wilson Boulevard in Rosslyn, Virginia, and I watched this. It looked like a commuter plane, 2-engine, come down from the south, real low, proceed right on and crashed right into the Pentagon.
Went directly into the Pentagon?
That is correct.
Looked like a deliberate act?
A deliberate act, sir.
And can you tell me what direction it came from, Don?
It came from the south.
Came from the south, up along the river, across the land?
It came from the south.
Okay, and did you happen to look at your watch? We thought it was just a little bit before 10 o'clock.
Well, I was watching ABC News, watching the Twin Tower, and about the time I saw the plane, I watched it come in very low over the trees, and it just dipped down, came down right over 395, right into the Pentagon.
And are you fairly sure that it was what we sometimes describe and recognize as a small commuter plane?
Yes, it was.
Good, Don. Thank you very much. Appreciate your help.
You're
Don
very
Wright,
welcome.
an eyewitness to the crash at the Pentagon. Now, we have had, as I said, reports today. There are hundreds of reports flying around, and so we beg your indulgence on us saying as often as we do, these are reports. They're sometimes unconfirmed. They're sometimes confirmed. We'll try to make it absolutely clear what we absolutely know and what we're uncertain about. There are now reports around of 3 aircraft having been hijacked today. So we have at least, because we've now had eyewitnesses to 3 apparently deliberate aerial assaults involving the aircraft themselves, 2 on the trade towers in New York City and 1 on the Pentagon itself, just described by Don Wright as a small 2-engine commuter plane which came up from the south. And we now believe that 3 planes were hijacked, 2 of them from Boston and 1 from somewhere else. We are not yet sure precisely what's happened. John, you're listening. Just to clarify for people, John, who's one of our leading reporters on crime, knows New York City probably better than anybody in many news divisions. I cannot tell you where that happens. That's either U.S. Air Force or Navy aircraft, fighter aircraft, now on patrol in what we've described as the no-fly zone over New York City today, lest there be one more attempt. John, go ahead.
They've continued evacuations in the area now. They're evacuating Battery Park City, which is a large apartment complex taking up many blocks across the street from the World Trade Center. And they've evacuated the federal court buildings where the terrorism trials of Ramzi Youssef and others were held. Anything that could be a symbolic target is now being emptied out in New York. New York is going into kind of a lockdown mode. I think you'll also see in Washington the same kind of air patrols have been scrambled around principal buildings there.
Okay. We have on the phone one of those people who makes his living analyzing terrorism. Kyle Olson, do you hear me?
Yes, I do.
I wonder if on a day like this anybody wants to be thought of as an expert on terrorism. Be that as it may, and assuming that, and knowing that much of the country is shocked at the apparent breadth of this, are you?
Well, you know, this is the kind of attack that has fallen more into Tom Clancy novels than into actual response planning. Having said that, we've been anticipating for a long time. We've wondered why it's been so relatively quiet. The suggestions of Osama bin Laden's involvement. What has he been doing since Cole? Other groups out there with a real or imagined grudge against the United States. The nature of the event is shocking. The fact that it's happened is not.
Thank you very much, Kyle. Really appreciate it. Kyle Olson.
Yeah, one quick thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
One quick thing. The suggestions that are floating around out there right now. There's apparently this claim from the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
Right.
Very interesting to know. If this is legitimate, if this claim stands up, this appears to be the first time this group has targeted Americans. This group has primarily steered away from the more extreme end of the violence scale. They focused less on suicide bombings, more on gun attacks and that sort of thing in the territories against Israelis.
Well, if
this holds up, this is a very different tactic.
Well, if it is true, and of course the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine was very much involved in attacking aircraft in the 1970s, which carried Americans. So certainly let's accept your notion that it's a recent attack on Americans. Thank you, Kyle, very much.
You bet.
As Mr. Olson makes clear, there has been at least one claim, and those of us who cover this for a very long period of time are always suspicious of claims. People who cover international terrorism. I'm going to interrupt myself. Linda Douglas, our Capitol Hill correspondent, I think is on the phone, and if she's not, she already reports there has been an explosion of some kind at the Capitol. Is Linda Douglas on the telephone? Let's get her on the phone as quickly as we have. She just reported a couple of minutes ago that the leaders of the Congress, Senator Lott, Senator Daschle, the Republican and Democratic leaders in the Senate, had been taken to some undisclosed secure location. Our general assumption is that there's no panic involved in this, that somebody in the Capitol building, as someone in the White House, has a book which says that when these things happen, here, Thomas, maybe you can confirm this for me, when these things happen, there are certain modalities which you behave, and as you see the hierarchy of the American political establishment, the military establishment being attacked, you want to protect the chain of command.
Absolutely. The first thing they try to do is get everyone in secure positions so they can gather information and make decisions about what to do next. One of the things that law enforcement officials had been planning for is the notion of a multi-tiered attack, an attack occurring in multiple places simultaneously. Because one of the things they've talked about is that terrorists want to project more fear, as much fear as possible, and one of the ways you can do it is to have this notion that attacks are happening on multiple fronts.
Yeah, well, and we've never seen anything like this before in the United States, of course, and in fact, not seen anything like this in my recollection. I've been doing this for 30-some-odd years. I don't recall any multitude of attacks. We've had two suicide bombers in a short period of time in the Middle East. We had the two embassies in Africa, in Kenya and in Tanzania, the attack 2 summers ago in the United States. But the notion that that terrorists, either an organization or organizations, plural, should be able to mount a concerted effort against the United States in this way, causing in this instance so many casualties, in the instance of the trade tower certainly so many casualties, is going to astound people in the political and military and intelligence establishment.
Absolutely. The notion that you could have multiple attacks like this, they had been planning for it, they had not seen it. This is an extraordinary escalation, one that they were predicting would happen, but no one would think that would happen this quickly.
Okay. John Miller?
I think...
let me just interrupt. I apologize again. We're now looking at a helicopter over the Pentagon. That makes perfect sense this morning. But given the fact that we're all sensitive to the presence of any aircraft, that was a helicopter that just flew across the screen. That is, and as we had at least one eyewitness said, this was an attack on the Pentagon from the south. He described it quite confidently as resembling a commuter aircraft, which is to say smaller than a small private aircraft and not as large as a commercial jet. It may have been a prop jet. It may have been a jet, but it's a smaller version of the jets which so many people in so many middle-sized American cities are now accustomed to seeing.
In terms of the realm of terrorism, this is going to be a real first test, literally by fire, for the Bush administration. You recall, after the embassy bombings in East Africa, the Clinton administration waited about 10 days and launched a missile attack against the camps of Osama bin Laden, who they felt confident at that time they could say was responsible for it, and who's since been charged in it. In this case, I think this ratchets up.
Excuse me. This is the Pentagon we're looking at now, according to my monitor. And again, it is hard to grasp what part of the building We do not know if they're in the courtyard or outside, but you can see that a fairly considerable amount of damage has been done. We do not know whether these are offices or storage areas. The Pentagon is full of many thousands of people every day. The Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld has been saying only yesterday and today that he wants to reduce the bloatedness, as he put it, as he alluded to it in the military and the bureaucracy. But this is the great home of the military bureaucratic establishment. John, before I come back to you, Dennis Cross is on the phone. Dennis, do you hear me? Dennis Cross, do you hear me?
Yes, I can, Peter.
Dennis, I understand that you were in the World Trade Center when either this or these attacks occurred. Am I correct?
That's correct. It was, I guess it was slightly before 9 o'clock, and I work on the 36th floor in One World Trade Center. I work in the insurance industry. Probably hundreds of people in my industry in both of these two buildings.
And what happened?
As I was...
Hey, Dennis, just let me stop for a second. Somebody is trying another telephone on this line. Could they please not do that while we listen to Mr. Cross? Thanks. Go ahead, Mr. Cross. Go ahead, Dennis.
Essentially, I was, sort of at my desk working, general office activity, and felt an enormous... I almost felt like an earthquake. Like I could literally feel and see things in the office moving and the floor moving. Immediately after it was some sort of explosion or something, there was an enormous volume of debris and paper. It almost looked like a dirty parade. All of this material just falling down. I was looking out the south side of One World Trade, and everybody in the office was kind of screaming, kind of gathering in the middle, and I went to the window, and I immediately saw one woman who appeared to be motionless, laying on the roof of a lower building next to me. At that point, everybody started to gather the things. They were trying to evacuate people down the stairwell.
Did the electricity go out in the building?
The lights flickered a couple of times, and then it was weird. It was kind of like there was one sort of rush, and then shortly after that there was another one. I don't know if it was maybe the other tower or if it were elevators in the inside. Sort of just dropping to the floor.
Are you aware that one of the Twin Trade Towers has now collapsed on itself?
Yeah, I'm about probably 5 blocks from there on the corner of Greenwich and Warren.
And as we looked at it on the screen here, Dennis, we could see the smoke from this collapse just billow forward through the lower blocks of Manhattan. Did you have a sense of that?
Completely. I was at that point. I'm a little bit northwest, certainly north, maybe to the west side of Tower 1, and I was trying to get to Broadway. My wife works on the other side of downtown here, and I'm still trying to get there, but the smoke, I couldn't see. It was a wall of smoke, and if you were in it, you couldn't see. If you were out of it, you could just see the wall of smoke. It was,
How
never
difficult?
seen anything.
I'm sorry for interrupting. How difficult was the evacuation?
Up there. It's more changing. I'm sorry, say that again, Peter?
How difficult was it to evacuate the building from at least from the 110 stories in the building?
I would say that it wasn't extremely difficult. It was just slow going down a somewhat narrow stairwell. If there was any sort of people who weren't able to move quickly, then it literally slowed down or stopped everybody. I was on 36, so it wasn't too terrible. When I got down to the 15th or 12th floor or so, there was water coming in from the doors, kind of at our feet level. And then it just was a waterfall down continually down all of the stairs, probably, in some cases 3-4 inches deep. At that point, sirens and alarms were going off, and then people started to get a little frantic there.
Dennis, thank you very much.
Okay,
I really appreciate you calling in. Dennis Krause, who works did work on the 36th floor of the World Trade Center in this particular tower, which is still standing. There's only one of the trade towers now standing, the other having collapsed on itself not long ago. All of the federal office buildings in Washington have now been evacuated. All federal buildings in Washington have now been evacuated. All aircraft in the skies over the United States have been ordered to land at the nearest airport. All aircraft on the ground intending to go anywhere have been ordered not to take off. Because the country, this is the Pentagon, because we've just seen a moment ago that at least one portion of one side or building at the Pentagon itself has actually collapsed. And as we warned you, the whole business of responsibility, claiming of and naming responsibility would be complicated. And now we've, from the Middle East, a senior official from the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine has denied any involvement, any connection to a double plane crash on the World Trade Center. It was, in fact, earlier on an anonymous caller who had called Abu Dhabi Television to say that the DFLP was responsible. So for today, we'll put aside as best we can on trying to understand who did it, just knowing somebody who did it. Now, one of the planes that crashed into the World Trade Center was, as we said some while ago, American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles. That has now been confirmed by the airline itself, or at least by their spokesperson, Lori Bassani. It was a Boeing 767. It would, under normal circumstances, if it were full, carry about 160 passengers, including 2 pilots, 9 or 10 crew, but we have no idea yet whether or not the plane was heavily loaded or not.
Peter, big concern now from the scene that the Northwest Tower, the one remaining standing, is leaning and buckling in the northwest corner. They're moving back the mobilization areas, and they're cordoning off the area in a much wider zone now, because obviously they are now concerned about the possibility of a second collapse.
I'm still desperately confused, John, about what may have caused the building to collapse.
As you watch the videotape, it appeared to buckle from the middle, from the point of impact and collapse, which, with no background in architecture, I don't know about the structural vulnerability, but as you see, debris starts to fall away. Then it cracks, and then it just goes straight down. And now they say that the other tower is leaning. If you look at some of the pictures, it appears to be on a slight angle to the right. They say the fire is also spreading downward now through the tower. And I think there's a real decision to make there. I have not been able to hear whether they're keeping people in there to fight that fire, or they're just leaving it empty to let the fire burn itself out, because they're going to have a real problem with people in there if it's in jeopardy.
At the same time, New York firefighters have a reputation of staying until the very end, and if there are civilians in that building which need to be rescued, and clearly there are, then there's no way the emergency services, I can imagine, are going to pull out at this point.
And if the elevators are disabled from that height, there's no fast way out.
Precisely. 110 stories down, and this appears to have occurred, this occurred about 2/3 of the way up. ABC's John McCarthy now confirms for us what we've had from an eyewitness, or he adds to our eyewitness, saying that a small plane heading north, which is exactly what our eyewitness a little earlier told us, exploded at the base of the Pentagon, at the base of one wing of the Pentagon. They evacuated everyone inside, and there was subsequent concern, which may have led to the FAA decision to ground everything, that there was concern that another plane might be inbound towards the Pentagon. And by grounding everything, of course, by ordering everything to be grounded on all radio channels to all aircraft that are flying in the area, it puts the military, Pierre Thomas confirmed for me, it puts the military in a position to take aggressive action, as the White House did when other aircraft had come close in the past.
Absolutely, absolutely. What it allows them to do is to get a better sense of incoming. If you're ordering everything down, you're essentially clearing the sky so the Pentagon can see what's coming in. Another question that they have to look at here is whether any of these planes might have been laced with explosives to cause the additional collateral damage once the impact occurred.
Yeah, these in every instance, well, I shouldn't say in every instance, certainly in the instance of the Pentagon, it looks more than a single aircraft just exploding on the ground. But again, we don't know precisely the size of the aircraft. We won't speculate on that. But Lisa Stark, who covers aviation for us, confirms that it was American Flight 11 to Los Angeles. There were 90 passengers and crew on board. And there was a second plane. Help me understand this now. So we believe that the 2 aircraft have flown into the trade towers. Both belonged to American Airlines, and they had both been hijacked. And there were 90 passengers and crew on the first plane and 60 passengers and crew on the second plane. That is if there's any doubt about that, someone please contradict me, but that is the report I am getting from our people who cover the Federal Aviation Administration and air travel in general, that there were 2 aircraft hijacked for this attack on the twin trade towers, now the single trade tower in New York City. And on the first, there were both flights to the West Coast from Boston. And the first one had 90 people and a crew on board, and the second had 60 passengers and crew on board. I beg your pardon. The second plane was not hijacked from Boston, but from Dulles Airport, we're being told, which of course is outside Washington, and we do not know if that was the... I'm going to make this absolutely clear because this reporting is muggy. We've now reports of 2 planes from American Airlines, one from Boston, Flight 11 to Los Angeles, which we believe is one of the aircraft that went into the trade towers. We have a second plane, American Airlines Dulles to Los Angeles, with 60 passengers and crew, and that is certainly bigger than a small commuter aircraft, so it may also have been involved in the near. We'll do our best to hand that down as well. Senior law enforcement officials in Washington now tell us that a car bomb has exploded outside the State Department. That's it's a report now from the Associated Press, about to confirm it with our own people at the State Department, though everybody in Washington has been evacuated from their buildings. But a car bomb has now exploded outside the State Department. And John Miller, I see you writing quite frantically on something else.
So, at the scene now at the World Trade Center, because of the concerns of the structural stability of the remaining tower, a temporary headquarters mobilization point triage center was set up at Stuyvesant High School, which is about 2.5 blocks up and slightly across the street. Now the concern is that if the building falls, if the second building falls, that it will be falling in that direction. So they are now evacuating their own command post and triage center, and they have to find an even further zone to move that to. Something that is striking about this today is that this is indicative of, with a car bomb at the State Department, a plane crash into the Pentagon, 2 planes designated to crash into each tower of the World Trade Center, bringing one down. It connotes the level of planning and sophistication and extreme logistical ability that probably makes this singularly the largest, most well-coordinated act of terrorism, not just in U.S. history, but probably in modern times. Yeah, unprecedented.
And every time you say that, I'm going to go immediately to Washington, but every time you say that, I keep thinking of how we are told time and time and time again by the Pentagon and by the State Department that they know something's going on in the world today.
They seem to have the problem at the North Tower, Peter.
Let's look at the North Tower quickly.
Seems to be coming down.
Oh my God.
The second tower.
It's hard to put it into words, and maybe one doesn't need to. Both trade towers, where thousands of people work, on this day, Tuesday, have now been attacked and destroyed, with thousands of people either in them or in the immediate area adjacent to them. There is simply no way to accurately describe the emotion this evokes in people all over the world, friends of the United States and enemies of the United States as well. John Miller, very briefly, you said to us just a few minutes ago that this was their concern, that they thought after the first tower went that the second one was vulnerable.
There was constant intelligence that terrorist organizations, and specifically that financed by Osama bin Laden, was trying to mount another series of attacks against the United States. Of course, they thought of the symbolic targets. The most symbolic was the World Trade Center because it had been attacked yet not brought down. And it seems that those concerns that even caused the World Trade Center to hire a senior FBI counterterrorism official just weeks ago to try and beef up security have come home to roost. It's also interesting to say that there is no type of security
which would have prevented against this today. Well, that may not. I was going to say that may not altogether be true because security operates in waves and concentric circles out around the world. Now we've lost the picture from there, so now we have it again. Well, wherever you are in the United States or in the world today, the landscape of New York City has just been changed. And one has to assume that thousands of lives have been extinguished. And it may be presumptuous to say thousands, but thousands of people work in these buildings, and given the difficulties of evacuating these buildings where, as we've said several times, the elevators may not have been operating and were not operating in at least one tower, tower number 2, the first one which is to go. That is the second attack on the southern tower. The first higher on this end of town, but both those towers have now gone. And here's a picture that doesn't exist anymore because that's not a live picture anymore. Good Lord, it just... Now, can I ask where this picture is from? Do we know where this is? This is
outside the World Trade Center. The sign indicates the approach to the
Brooklyn Bridge. To the Brooklyn Bridge. So we're
on West Street, approximately just north of Vesey Street there.
And you can see the dust and debris. And this is I don't know if this is at an early stage or whether this is right now. It's at an early stage because there in the distance you can see at least one of the towers still standing as people wander, many of them dazed. And look at the cell phones in their ears. This is, in a cell phone society, and it's certainly true in the Middle East, people on their cell phones all the time seeking and offering reassurance to their families and their friends that something has happened. In Israel, and at least those who have them in the Palestinian territories these days, there's constant traffic on the cell phones because there is such tension in the region and such tension here today, which is extraordinary, that people wanting everywhere to reassure or find out about what has happened to those who are near and dear to them.
One thing we should update for people listening, particularly in this area, who may have been worried, there was a concern that if this building...
You mean in the New York City area?
Yes. There was a concern if this building fell that it would land on the center they had set up at Stuyvesant High School, where the students were still there. The reports from Stuyvesant High School now are that everybody there is okay.
Stuyvesant High School, the high school in the adjacent area, which the city and the state authorities set up to deal with the casualties that they could get out of the building or had occurred adjacent to the building. It is just clear that a lot of people, we do not know how many, got out of the building. And it is going to take time. It is going to take time. The New York City Office of Emergency Management, which monitors the city and all its vulnerable points, said when this whole thing began this morning, they could not get an immediate handle on precisely what was happening. And it was only, you've seen this before, this is a recording of precisely what happened when the second tower went down. And this is from a very long distance. This camera is located on the edge of the Hudson River on the West Side Drive up the western side of Manhattan, and I cannot say this is something that people never believed they would see in the United States, because of course Oklahoma City was when we all had that reaction, when Americans experienced terrorism in the heartland for the first time, believing in many cases that it all happened somewhere else. But I just think that millions of Americans will be stunned by the magnitude of this today. I'm trying to track down John McWethy, our correspondent at the Pentagon. He was evacuated. I'm saying this as much to our control room as anybody. He, like everybody else, was evacuated. And I'd also like to talk, if I may, to Claire Shipman at the White House to see what the progression is there, and Linda Douglas at Capitol Hill, because we do know that the leadership of the Senate, at least,
was en route to Milwaukee today. And now with the planes grounded, he's going to have to communicate by phone. They have an internal communication system at the Justice Department that they use in situations like this, video monitors. But again, everyone is dispersed, and with the planes grounded, this created a scenario that they, quite frankly, hadn't seen before.
It is the grounding of the planes which pretty much brings to a halt. I mean, one assumes that Air Force One, with the President, is already on its way back to Florida. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. ABC's John McWethy is on a cell phone at the moment, and while he cannot hear me, somebody can tell him to start talking, please, and we'll listen. Okay, we'll try that again. Anytime John McWethy begins to talk and tell us what's happening at the Pentagon, or as much as he knows what's happening at the Pentagon, we will simply let him go. But it's just very difficult to get through on cell phones. Thousands of people trying to find out where their friends and their relatives are. Thousands of reporters, news organizations, of city organizations, state organizations, federal organizations, trying to understand not only what happened today, which in some respects is secondary, but to get something done. And there's just so much agitation around. You get a report just a couple of moments ago from the security at the Capitol Police saying that they believe a hijacked plane may be bound for the Capitol. There's an intensity in the air and a fear and a trauma in the air at 20 minutes to 11 Eastern Time in the United States, 20 minutes to 8 on the West Coast, or in the western part of the United States. The day has just getting beginning, and all of this has happened in just under an hour. The first attack on the Trade Tower was just before 10 o'clock. The second one came at 3 minutes after 10. We have a strike on the Pentagon, which came a little after that, and the country is just riddled. 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock, I'm sorry. The country is just overrun, as it's inevitable it would be with rumors. I'm curious, John, in terms of the emergency operation that you monitor, are they in a sense of panic? Are they or just in a sense of chaos?
In a sense of chaos. There was a brief sense of panic, which is understandable when the first tower collapsed. By the time the second tower collapsed, they were prepared for it. There were numerous other injuries. The level of coordination is incredible. The FDR Drive, which is a main artery, has been shut down for the purpose of keeping it clear for ambulances to go to hospitals. They've anticipated that the lower Manhattan hospitals in New York City will fill up, so they have started to arrange helicopter flights to go to hospitals further out in the circle. They've really been pretty well coordinated throughout this. If you can possibly be coordinated during a series of spontaneous events that amount to disaster.
This is war, and war by another definition. We did manage to get Rebecca Cooper, one of our reporters, on the phone from the White House. That's how difficult it is at the moment to communicate. Rebecca, do you hear me? Rebecca Cooper at the White House, do you hear me? All right. The same case with Rebecca says with John McCarthy at the Pentagon. If we do hear from them, we'll simply interrupt and let them get on talking. Yeah, Rebecca, do you hear me?
Yes, Peter, I hear you. I'm in the basement of the 815 Connecticut Avenue. It's a building across the block from the White House, across the park. You know where that is, next to the Chamber of Commerce. I had to come down here because, as you said, none of the cell phones are working. I'm in the engineer's office, and they've given us their phones to use. There's a real dichotomy here at the White House, Peter. Tourists who still are not fully aware of what's happening across the nation are standing there watching with curiosity. They keep getting moved back, but those of us who are inside the White House realize the severity of the situation. I was inside the White House this morning trying to gather information for you when we were told by a very nervous White House security staff that they feared a plane was headed to the White House, and we heard planes indeed overhead, and they quickly evacuated all of us out of the White House. Now, I just got off the phone with my own crying mother who was very worried about where I was, and I will tell other mothers and fathers of people who work at the White House and reporters who work at the White House that most of the White House has been evacuated. In fact, in the building where I am now, people have cordoned up other offices to try and coordinate the federal response to this. There are actually phone calls being placed with the legal counsel of the FAA from this building because they don't have cell phone connection. They are out of their offices. They are doing a good job of coordinating the federal response from here, but they are having to take all kinds of emergency measures to coordinate this response. But even the White House chef, who just days ago was preparing a lovely state dinner for President Fox of Mexico, I saw him and I tried to speak to him, and frankly, Peter, he was too rattled. He said he couldn't speak, and he was with his staff, and they were all very anxious and very worried because, of course, they did know what's going on in the country today.
Many thanks, Rebecca Cooper. And if you just see that picture that was going by as Rebecca was talking, you get a real sense of what the urgency was in the White House. First of all, the White House police came walking out, and then people began to run out of the White House. In and of itself, astonishingly astonishing, because we live with the notion that if there is any place in the United States which is fiercely protected, including an anti-aircraft battery, at least one on the roof of the White House itself, this is the place where the President and the Vice President, of course, are to be secure. Claire Shipman is on the phone from the White House. Claire, we are now looking at what appear to be fairly relaxed security officers on the roof of the White House, looking at in the distance as they always do, talking occasionally to each other. There doesn't seem to be a high level of tension there. What's it like on the ground?
Well, there's considerable tension on the ground, Peter. We are actually looking at a similar picture because we're across the street from the White House now in the Hay Adams Hotel. The entire area around the White House has been completely evacuated. It's very quiet. The police seem tense. They're carrying automatic weapons. We've also seen a couple of what appear to be fighter jets overhead. Everybody in this area has been sent home from all major government offices. It's a reverse commute. The highways, we're told, are just jammed. As you know, President Bush is on his way back to the White House. They've checked his plane considerably before sending him on his way. But as you mentioned, these guys on top of the White House roof are almost always here, and ever since that incident a few years ago when a plane actually landed on the White House lawn, they've upped security measures so that they wouldn't have any other aircraft nearby. And that may be why they seem a little more relaxed than other areas around town. As you know, the AP has been reporting that there was a car bomb that went off at the State Department, and a lot of people are talking about that. And there's also been some report that there were bomb threats on Capitol Hill, but we're still trying to find out more about that, Peter.
Thanks very much, Claire. There are indeed reports from the Federal Aviation Administration that there are possibly 1 or 2 more planes that have been hijacked this morning and are still missing. When you think of the number of aircraft that crisscross the United States, not to mention fly overseas every day, this is the Pentagon. This is the Pentagon. This is live coverage from the Pentagon now, which gives you some sense of the force with which this aircraft, described to us as a small commuter-sized aircraft, flew into a side of the Pentagon coming from the south this morning. And again, the communications in the country are so difficult at the moment, and as you've heard beginning to hear from everybody, the cell phone network is choked for a variety of reasons, that it's hard to get a handle at this point on casualties at the Pentagon or the extent of damage. The one place on which it is in which we can be focused because it is such a small place, Manhattan, 11 miles long, is the Twin Trade Towers. And by some remote chance, if you've just joined us on television, the Twin Trade Towers in New York City have been destroyed, with hundreds, presumably, or perhaps thousands of people in them. Each of the two towers was struck today, attacked today by an aircraft, one of which at least we know was hijacked. And this is the second tower that went just a few minutes ago. A scene of chaos and devastation in the lower part of New York City, right on the edge of the Hudson River. Everybody in the United States is familiar with the Twin Trade Towers, and we have no idea whether there were tourists there who show up every morning to go and stand on the top of the trade towers, because it is one of the most expansive views south, west, and north of the city and the area itself. Bill Blakemore is down there. Bill, do you hear me?
I do, Peter.
Go ahead.
I'm just north of Canal Street, just a few blocks north of the Trade Tower area. Throngs of people have been, of course, moving north, some of them silent, most of them looking stunned, just saying we're just trying to get out of the area after both towers have collapsed. We're seeing Delta-wing jet fighters circling overhead, just one at a time. When the first one appeared, the group of people amid which I was standing shrieked and said, "Oh my God, there's another attack," and then they realized that being a Delta-wing jet fighter, it was probably the U.S. military, which of course it seems to be. There's just a couple of helicopters, apparently police helicopters, circling overhead, and on this very clear morning now, the unusual sight is the lack of the trade towers sticking up above the buildings that are normally here. People have now begun to accept, but just barely begun to accept what's happened. All business at a complete standstill, nothing but sirens down here as these throngs move further and further north, just walking away from what they can barely begin to understand. Peter?
Bill, how far north did this, I mean, we looked at some streets which debris had just gone in a huge, wide area.
Right. I seem to be just north of where that hit. I'm just up at Canal, so there seem to have been enough low-lying buildings, that is no more than, say, 20 or 30 stories high, between us and the base of the tower to have protected people here from the debris. But here's another man walking past me, just looking completely dazed, going north. Two or three other women. The crowds are beginning to thin out now, as most of the people who were just standing around and watching were working there. One woman came up just talking a mile a minute with her daughter and her friend and her daughter, describing how they had gone to their school this morning. She was about to go to the trade tower to pick up something from a shop there when her daughter said, "I want a sandwich, Mommy," and so she stayed back. She said, "Otherwise I would have been there." They're still trying to understand how they're so lucky not to have been over there. There must be thousands of such stories here this morning, Peter, of those that were the lucky ones.
Thank you, Bill. Please stay in touch as often as you can. It's now 10 minutes to 11 Eastern Time, 10 minutes to East in 2 minutes to 8 in the West. And I'm just going to add to the chaos and the trauma of the day by saying that a large plane has now crashed just north, or shouldn't I say just, but crashed about 10 o'clock in the last 15 minutes north of Somerset County Airport, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. This is reporting from one of the Pittsburgh television stations as a result of a 911 call from the airport itself. There are no other details on this crash yet. And it's not clear whether the crash was related to anything else that has happened in the country today. But the plane, which was believed to be a Boeing 767, crashed about 10 a.m., just about 8 miles east of Jennerston, Pennsylvania. People in the area will undoubtedly be reporting in more clearly to us on that. The New York mayor's race is having a primary today. That has now been canceled. Both on the Republican and the Democratic side, there was I apologize for interruption. Somebody's trying to say something. Go ahead, please. Okay, just stand by just for 1 second.
Fred there?
Yeah, Fred, pick it
The
up.
New York Maryland primary has been canceled today, and as we said, there's reaction coming in from the Middle East, including a claim of responsibility, then a denied responsibility, now a message from the Palestinian President Yasser Arafat condemning the aircraft attacks on the World Trade Center and sending the condolences of the Palestinian people to those who have been victimized by it. Outside the Pentagon, another member of our ABC News staff, Chris Dreer. Chris, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Peter.
So would you tell us what you can see?
Yes, Peter. I'm standing at the fringe of Arlington Cemetery watching the Pentagon as the top of it caves in. There's a lot of black smoke, a lot of twisted debris. The Pentagon itself has caved in from the top. There is much fire coming out of the windows. It looks like something from World War II, Peter.
Chris, can you tell me, it's a little hard to tell on television, how much of the building has collapsed? How wide is it? How deep is it? Do you have a sense of that?
Yes, I do, Peter. The center portion of the Pentagon appears to be breached. That is, apparently there's a courtyard, and the of that is completely caved in from where I am, from where I see it.
Okay, I think you're on a cell phone, Chris, but just confirm for me that a portion of the building has been breached and the aircraft appears to have pushed its way through into the courtyard?
Yes, indeed it has. I believe, Peter, that that's where the plane is, but I am not sure at this time.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. Is there any evidence, is there any movement around there at the moment? We're looking at a fairly static picture. Are the people arriving, people disappearing, ambulances coming?
Peter, there's a great deal of glass and wind fire coming out of the windows, but on the other side of the Pentagon is where most of the emergency vehicles are now. I'm going to try and get around to that side to see what I can see.
Okay, thank you very much. I should tell you that all military personnel in the District of Columbia area now, all military personnel in the district are now on something that is called Threat Level Delta, which is the highest state of alert in the military, and all other military personnel in the country are now on alert status Charlie, which, John Miller, we know is a somewhat lower status of alert, but still a reminder that this disaster has spread like wildfire through all of the political and military establishment in the country. All museums and monuments in Washington are now shut for the day. It's ironic to hear Claire Shipman telling us there that tourists are still standing around waiting to get into the White House today. Not surprisingly, unfamiliar perhaps with what has happened everywhere else, though, as it was, for example, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, word spread dramatically, mouth-to-mouth, person-to-person across the country, in a huge wave of information and emotion and confusion. And now...
Good morning, I'm Del Walters in the ABC 7 News Studios. We are interrupting ABC's coverage to bring you up to date on the developments that are happening here in Washington. I'm joined by Carol Costello. Safe to say that Washington is in a state of high alert. We are receiving a report that, as you heard Peter Jennings say, that all of the government buildings in Washington, all of the employees in the government buildings in Washington have been told to go home. All of the museums have been closed.
Including the National Zoo.
Including the National Zoo. And as you can hear, basically, we don't know at this point what buildings may or may not have been targeted by these terrorists, and that is the reason for this extraordinary activities. We have a reporter on the phone right now from the Capitol, Horace Holmes. Horace, bring us up to date as to what's going on there.
The area, Del, around the Capitol has been totally sealed off. We're standing on the corner of Independence and Washington Avenue. About a 4 or 5 block area around the Capitol has been sealed off. Police just not letting any, even people walking on the streets get anywhere near the Capitol building. We have been hearing, and you can probably hear in the background, sirens going. A lot of police activity, police cruisers and paddy wagons and even ambulances traveling at high rates of speed up Independence Avenue. When we arrived on the scene, there were just people everywhere in the streets. All the buildings around the Capitol building have been evacuated, so there are workers at HHS and the FDA and Department of Education all out in the streets just kind of wandering around asking police officers, where do I go and what do I do, asking them, can I get to Union Station, asking them if the subways are operating. a lot of panic out here in the streets, quite frankly, and a lot of confusion.
Of course, we understand the airports have been closed down in our area. D.C. Fire Department, Prince George's Fire Department, Alexandria Fire Department, all personnel have been asked to come in to work no matter what their shifts. Horace, what about people who just live in the area? They must be afraid, too.
Yes, as a matter of fact, they can't. People who live just in Capitol Hill can't get to their homes right now because police have just totally sealed off this area. We've seen a number of people who say, "Well, I just live right down the street there," and police are saying, "I'm sorry, but we can't let you into the area around the Capitol."
We understand from also the State Department, there were initial reports that a car bomb had exploded there. We understand now that no car bomb has exploded at the State Department, although it has been evacuated. Although at the Pentagon, the plane did hit the Pentagon. Part of the roof has fallen in, but we don't know the extent of injuries there. We don't know if anyone's been terribly hurt because, of course, in these situations, it's very hard to get information. Horace, do you have any information about injuries?
No, have not heard anything about that at all.
Horace, what about with regards to the members of Congress? Have you seen any of them coming, going, or extraordinary measures to evacuate the members of the House and the Senate?
I talked to one gentleman who was in a House Judiciary subcommittee meeting that had just begun when he said there were members of the House in that meeting, and police came in and told them to evacuate. What we've seen, we were over there by the garage of one of the office buildings, and police were escorting members of Congress out of the area at very high rates of speed, obviously.
We want to take a shot of the 14th Street Bridge because it's an odd sight because usually there's a lot of traffic on the 14th Street Bridge. There was a lot of outbound traffic a little bit earlier. As you can see, people are actually walking across the bridge to get out of the district. Everybody wants to get out of the city for very obvious reasons. That is an eerie sight.
That picture itself is actually a testament to how quickly the District of Columbia was evacuated. This entire tragedy has been unfolding now for about the last 2 hours. About 20 minutes ago, that bridge was packed. Obviously, the last time anybody in the Washington area can remember seeing the city itself clearing out has been one of the snowstorms that we had, the most recent being 1996 when there was gridlock on the streets. But everybody appears to have decided to go home to collect their loved ones. I've talked to people that were in high-ranking government positions who simply said, I have to go home.
Yeah, a lot of things have been closed down, too, for obvious reasons. We want to join Greta Cruz, who is in our newsroom. She has the list for us. Greta.
Okay, well, Carol and Del, the list keeps changing as we speak. This is what we know. You did mention that all federal government offices are shut down, that all of the monuments are closed, the Smithsonian closed, including the zoo, which is farther north in the city. At this point, as far as, let's start with the schools. D.C. public schools are still open. They are meeting right now, officials, to decide whether or not they will be closing D.C. public schools early. At this point, everything is still on. Howard University is closing at noon today. American University in Northwest is canceling all classes this afternoon and this evening. Arlington Public Schools, we are told they're getting lots of calls, obviously. They are going to keep the kids in school. If parents do want to go to the school and pick their children up, they may do so. However, they are not letting the children out early. The University of Virginia, the Northern Virginia Center, will be closing at noon today. And the Corcoran College of Art and Design is now closed. A few other things I will pass along. We were told earlier that BWI Airport is still allowing incoming flights because planes obviously do have to land, although the FAA nationwide is shutting down airports, but some of them will remain open to allow flights to land. Metro is still open, folks. We are told, however, that the Pentagon station has shut down because of the fire and the problems out there, but for the rest of the system, the subway system is open. It is crowded, obviously. We are in pretty much a reverse commute in the city of Washington right now. The streets are open, the bridges are open, except for those secured areas we told you, Horace Holmes, around the Capitol. Many of those streets will be shut down because the police have cordoned them off as a safety measure. The stretch of 395 Shirley Highway by the Pentagon is also shut down because of the fire out at the Pentagon. We understand that D.C. Mayor Tony Williams is at the Reeves Center downtown. That is with the command center. He is fine. Everything is in control there. The White House and all the other buildings downtown have been evacuated. And right now we do not have any word on any casualties locally. as a result of all of these incidents, but we will keep you posted as more becomes available.
Yeah, Greta,
Back to you.
Greta, we just got off the phone with an Air Force spokesperson. He says he has no idea if anyone was killed inside of the Pentagon. Of course, we will be trying to effort that information.
I also want to add, too, we did get a request, and I don't know if you mentioned this or not, that D.C., Prince George's, and Alexandria are all asking their fire department personnel and their EMS. Everyone needs to report to work today immediately, regardless of their schedules. They're going to need every man and woman possible today.
And Greta, I think it's safe to say that even though no state of emergency has been declared, we are in a state of crisis. And if you are out there listening and you are a nurse, you are a doctor, you are a member of an EMS squad, a firefighter, or a police officer, it stands to reason logic. Phone your commander, your base, and simply report in for duty. We still don't know whether or not we have seen the worst. Like the rest of the nation, we here in Washington are bracing ourselves. We are hoping, we are praying that we have. But we're going to return right now to ABC News, where they continue to cover not only the events here in Washington, but also the events that are unfolding around the nation, because we are fearing now that this may have escalated even further. We join ABC and Peter Jennings right now.
Certainly have focused on bin Laden as the bête noire and as the architect of terrorism against U.S. officials, U.S. citizens. But in this case, the resources and the coordination and the direction to do these kinds of events requires capabilities beyond any one single group. In other words, there had to be cooperation, possibly with some state support, to do this kind of thing.
Okay.
I mean, we've been hearing for the last 2 months that bin Laden was getting ready to do something, but I don't think anyone was looking here as the object of his next event.
Okay, Vince, I much appreciate it, and I hope you go work the beat for us and you check back with us through the day. I'm, by the way, this is not for an immediate discussion, but I'm sitting next to John Miller of ABC News, who you've heard often this morning. He's one of the only reporters in the world to have gone to see Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. And as the day goes on, we'll clearly deal with this in even greater depth, John, than at the moment. But what we are now dealing with is a devastating human tragedy as the result of terrorism in New York City and in Washington, D.C. And just before I talk to John Cock, well, I'm more than happy to listen to these people on the street if we can possibly hear from them. But just in case, by some remote possibility, at 8 o'clock Pacific time, along the West Coast, you've just turned on your television or you're continuing to watch it, let me just review for you where we think we are at the moment. Because it is both a tragedy that has revealed itself before the eyes of millions of people in the country watching on television, and a complete mystery as to how, as we heard from Vince Calistrauer just a moment ago, how this could have happened in such a coordinated way with any of the intelligence service of the United States having much clue about it. So just before 9 o'clock this morning, just at about 8:50, an aircraft, which we now believe had been hijacked and flew into a building, hit a building. And then shortly after that, that was at 9 o'clock, or just after it, showed up on the wire services about 9:04. We could see it happen live on television as a second aircraft hit the other tower of the twin trade towers in New York City. Thousands of people had just arrived at work. As time passed, we understood that these aircraft had been, we believed, hijacked in both instances. Perhaps certainly one, an American Airlines aircraft which was destined for Los Angeles, had been hijacked and flown. Pilot either forced to fly, very hard to believe, and of course we'll never know unless they find the black boxes from these aircraft, or somebody on board that aircraft killed or got rid of the pilot and went to the controls and flew the plane into the building themselves. And then as much of the country began to connect and try to grapple with this, then we had this horrifying circumstances of first one of the towers, this is the second aircraft flying in, then first one of the towers and then the other tower collapsing on itself with, at the very least, hundreds and probably thousands of people who did not manage to get out of the building after the two initial collisions. And the country, the political and military establishment of the country just began to lock down very quickly. First of all, there was concern at the White House because outside the west side of the White House behind the Executive Office building, we then began to see that there was fire, and that was what appears now to have been an attack on the Pentagon. Just shortly thereafter, this was this other tower of the Pentagon, first tower of the Pentagon, which began to fall down upon itself. The World Trade Centers, of course, is what I mean. Thank you. Just stay out of my ear for a second. I'm trying to bring people up to date on the order of which things happened. So we then had New York City's airspace all around locked down. The airports closed down at LaGuardia and Newark and John F. Kennedy. Nobody was allowed to take off. And then shortly after that, the Federal Aviation Administration became involved and told aircraft nowhere in the country to take off. And then all aircraft flying anywhere in the country, because there was so much concern, and there is still some, that there is an aircraft somewhere out in the country which has been unaccounted for. All aircraft in the country were ordered to land immediately at the nearest airport. And then, of course, the second devastating thing at the trade towers themselves, when the second trade tower collapsed on itself. The president was in Florida, and the president, down in Florida today to talk about education, came very quickly to the cameras, clearly as shocked as any of us in the rest of the country. He talked to the FBI and others. He immediately canceled his education trip to Washington today, to Florida today, and said he was going to come back to Washington, which is exactly what the country expects of him. And he said very briefly on camera that this terrorism against the United States will not stand. As we've said before, the kind of thing he had to say. And John Cochran went to Florida with him. And John, I think you're still in Florida and the president came home. Is that my understanding?
That's right. We're grounded like all other Americans. The airport here is close to us. The president is on his way back, but we don't know where he's going to land. You know, normally, Peter, the president would land at Andrews Air Force Base, Maryland, a military base, a secure base just outside of Washington, D.C. However, network camera crews have been barred from going to Andrews Air Force Base. It apparently has been roped off and barred to news media. We do not know if the president is going there, and the White House is being very close-mouthed about it. And you can understand why they would want to create the question in some people's minds as to where the president will land. We've been told that when the president returns, he will have a National Security Council meeting. But where will that happen? Will it be in Washington? I can't help but think back to November 22nd, 1963, the assassination of John Kennedy. At that time, the Secret Service was in a great hurry to get the new president, Lyndon Johnson, back to Washington, D.C., a safe place. It's no longer clear today that Washington, D.C. is such a safe place, Peter.
Thank you very much, John. Please stay in touch and let us know when you can make your way to Washington. The uncertainty in Washington has led authorities to ask the political leadership in the Congress, we know at least in the Senate, to go to a safe location. Earlier reports about a bomb outside the State Department, we believe, are now not correct. But there was this attack on the Pentagon, and there's this mixture in Washington of deep, profound tension and almost and alertness. You certainly get a quick glimpse there of the security force, which is a constant presence on the roof of the White House, on guard there. But there is a natural instinct, not only for the president to go to Washington, not merely for the security, because it's the nation's capital, and it's where all of us in the country will look to the president for leadership and response in the hours and the days ahead. And it'll be maybe a couple of hours yet before the president gets to Washington. Meanwhile, on the ground, we have people of all persuasion, eyewitnesses, journalists on the ground, who have been party to seeing this thing and are beginning to piece together for us the human dimension of how horrendous this is. And this, of course, is Times Square, in which you can imagine that people have stopped, and this happens to be the ABC News screen in Times Square, which at a time like this, as Times Square has always been for more than a century, it's always been a place where people gather to see the news. But Drew Milhon, ABC News' Drew Milhon, actually saw this happen, and I believe, Drew, you're on the phone at the moment, am I correct?
Yes, Peter, I'm here.
Would you go ahead?
Sure. I was at the corner of Varick and Canal, which is about 10 to 12 blocks north of the World Trade Center, where roughly 300 to 400 people were gathered watching the flames and the smoke from both World Trade Centers going through the air. And I began to cross the street, and I heard a collective scream from this group of people. And I looked up, and the first World Trade Center that collapsed was falling down. The shriek lasted for quite a long time, and then many of these people fell into tears, just crying and sobbing. I don't know where my mother is. I don't know where my friends are. That sort of thing was heard all around this crowd.
Okay, Drew, where are you at the moment? You're in the same location?
Yes, I am. I'm at Varick. I'm just north of that now. I'm at Varick and Canal.
And people are not familiar, and people from outside New York are not familiar, but you're at the lower west corner of the island of Manhattan. And is that whole lower part of Manhattan being either evacuated or people just leaving it en masse?
It is being evacuated. No cars are allowed south of Canal, which is basically the last major thoroughfare that goes east to west on Manhattan. After the first Trade Center went down, I tried to get closer to the scene, and police and FBI agents were telling everyone, both plainclothes policemen and uniformed policemen were telling everyone they had to go north of Canal. They were pushing everyone back.
Okay, thank you very much, Drew Milhon. Please check in with developments. I can tell you that the reports that we now get from a variety of places, let me just stay with the map of New York City, because the New York City Emergency Management Center is, if you're looking at that map, is just like on the tip of the building there to the north. Both those buildings have gone, and at a moment like this, they and the political establishment in the city, as well as the state and federal authorities, would coordinate operations from in there. And there are other, as you look around that, Manhattan itself, as far up as the Williamsburg Bridge and beyond, of course, is the United Nations. People have always been concerned that at least two of the tunnels, the Holland Tunnel for one, the Lincoln Tunnel is not on that map, but these are the tunnels that go across the Hudson River to New Jersey and out onto the west, and that even perhaps the bridges. But elsewhere in the city, City Hall would be vulnerable as well. The United Nations, the tunnels, and of course FBI headquarters, which is about in the middle of Manhattan, not too far from the New York Stock Exchange, which you cannot see on that map at the moment. But there was nothing, John Miller's with me still, thank you very much, and I'm glad you are, nothing more patently, obviously vulnerable than the trade towers.
Or no larger set of symbolic targets. It's what they mean. They stand for American commerce. They stand for the American establishment, and in some way, just by their size and profile, American might. And the fact that they were an earlier target and that they withstood that, I think, made them even a more attractive target the second time around.
You can see people, and again, I'm not quite sure what we're looking at here, and I wish somebody would put pictures up. Okay, this is clearly a New York fire rig, and communications are extremely difficult, as you can imagine, in a circumstance like this.
One of the things
sometimes what you get is a picture that is either taken from a different angle or of a different thing.
One of the things they're grappling with here is what is the crime scene. They've been talking about that today. The crime scene unit responded expecting that they'd have a massive crime scene, the World Trade Center tower, then two towers. Then the two towers collapse, making their crime scene not only much more difficult process, but massive. Consider the prospect of sifting for evidence, trying to find the black boxes, the in-flight recorders, evidence of other explosives there.
Let me stop for just a sec, John. We'll come back to the notion of crime. But ABC's John McWethy is at the Pentagon. John, can you hear me? Jack, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you, Peter.
John McWethy, just go ahead and tell us what you know, what you've seen, how much information have you been able to put together?
Peter, this is one of those things that you dream of in your worst nightmares. It appears that a large jet aircraft, perhaps the size of a large passenger plane, came very low, clipping off light poles as it approached the Pentagon. It slammed into the side of the Pentagon, and it drove itself from the outer ring all the way to the inner ring. The area of the building that it went into burst into flames. There are many, many floors of destruction.
deep into the heart of the Pentagon. That area has now collapsed. The firemen have been there trying to put out the flames. There are obviously heavy casualties at the Pentagon. There have been ambulances and helicopters coming and going for the last hour. The area has been cordoned off. The skies above the Pentagon, there have been F-16s circling. The entire area has been evacuated. More than 20,000 people work in the Pentagon, Peter, and this is a disaster.
John, at ground level, for example, in the side of the building where the plane penetrated from the outer ring to the inner ring, do you know precisely what goes on in that section of the building?
I do not, Peter. That is not where the highest-ranking people are. The Secretary of Defense and most of the chiefs of the services are on a different side of the building. But in a way, it almost doesn't matter. There are going to be many high-ranking people from the Defense Department who are going to be either injured or killed in this attack.
And, John, is this something which the Pentagon is trying to take care of wholly itself? I mean, are we talking to you about a circumscribed military operation to emerge from this chaos?
It's very difficult, Peter. The FBI is here, local police are here, everyone is here trying to deal with the casualties initially and trying to make sure there isn't a second strike of any kind. That's the first inclination. That's all I can tell you at this point.
All right, let me ask you, John, because you cover intelligence and counterintelligence a lot of the time, trying to see that a second strike doesn't occur. How is the Pentagon defended in any way, and in any way similar to, for example, the anti-aircraft battery on top of the White House?
No, Peter. This Washington, D.C., because it is a democracy, has made a lot of decisions about how it is going to posture itself. And local law enforcement, FBI and CIA, have relied on intelligence as a way to defend the United States, and they're going to have to add some measures as a result of this.
And John, as it may be too chaotic at the moment to be talking to people about what is an intelligence failure this morning, and the intelligence services are going to have an enormous amount to answer for, clearly, at least in the public arena. Are you picking up anything that suggests anybody has the vaguest idea of who may have done this?
They are going back over every strand of intelligence, looking for either groups in the Middle East or anywhere else in the country. They learned a painful lesson after Oklahoma City, not to jump to conclusions. They're trying not to do this. But, Peter, there are very few organizations on the planet that could put together the kind of coordinated attack that we have seen today. That points most initial fingers at Osama bin Laden that has the money and the sophistication to do this.
Okay, John, thank you very much. I don't think we should be at all surprised that Osama bin Laden moves to the top of everybody's list in this. But John McCarthy makes a very interesting point, which we should talk to John Miller about this for a moment, which we should consider throughout the day. I remember sitting in this exact same chair at the time of the Oklahoma City bombing, and we all thought it was a Middle East attack. We all thought it was the Arabs attacking the United States, and that's where much of the violence is these days, but it was a sort of knee-jerk reaction, then it turned out to be one of our own.
That's right, and it was a conclusion that was jumped to by the law enforcement establishment because it seemed to fit the pattern of conduct, a massive truck bomb. The difference was it was stateside, yet they were certainly surprised when they learned within days, actually with a car stop of Timothy McVeigh, that it was a homegrown plot. These are bellwether events. When the World Trade Center blew up in New York City in 1993, everybody sighed and said, well, we said it couldn't happen here, and it finally has. When Oklahoma City blew up, they said we knew it could happen here, but we never thought it would be brought on by our own. This event certainly transcends either of those events by several fold, and of course, as you pointed out, people are already jumping to speculative conclusions, but whoever is behind this put together an incredibly sophisticated program. Just the idea that you would have multiple operators in multiple cities with the ability to get onto a plane with either the weaponry or false weaponry or explosives to be able to pull off a hijacking, again, probably with a locked cockpit.
3 of them, maybe.
Again, a hijacking and another hijacking and another, and maybe one that's still aloft, that you would be able to, and this is the part that has confounded me, and you touched on this, how do you make a pilot, a plane full of passengers, into a suicide pilot, a kamikaze to slam into a building? And if you do not, how do you, as the terrorist, have the level of sophistication to take over the controls of a sophisticated airliner jet plane to be able to fly accurately into targets like hitting dead center into the Pentagon, which is a low building?
You heard John McCarthy saying knocking off telephone poles, knocking down telephone poles as it came along.
Dead hits into the World Trade Center, one at the center, one near the top. As you pointed out, there's a lot of mystery to this, confounding mystery, an incredible scope.
Let's listen to this woman quickly. Well, we try to listen to this woman, not able to get her sound. Could somebody please turn up her sound if that's possible? We are looking at, in some cases here, because of the communications difficulties, but also the communication benefits we get from our ABC affiliate here in New York City. We're getting coverage which comes from a variety of sources.
What you're seeing is West Street there, a block north of the World Trade Center. That was an emergency service police officer collapsing on the street.
Let's listen to this man. Okay. Can I just ask our director to come to us for just a second, and then I think it... Mr. Goodman? Thank you very much. Let's just continue to review. There's a hard issue here for an enormous number of people. What you've seen on television this morning, those twin trade towers first being hit and then collapsing before our A's, has an almost distant, we talked to both Pierre and John, it has one distant quality to it because we're watching on television. We're so accustomed to violence on television. So accustomed, I mean, when the plane flew into one of the 2 towers which we saw before our eyes, you thought, well, you know, it's like the graphic artist, isn't it? So what we haven't had here yet is an appreciation of the suffering that's occurring on the streets and in those buildings.
Well, what the widening scope of the injuries, they have now notified hospitals in the outlying boroughs outside Manhattan, and they have cleared routes through the streets, covering miles, for caravans of ambulances to bring the injured out as they do the triage. The lower Manhattan and central Manhattan hospitals like Bellevue quickly filled up very early on. They have now set up a system of helicopters, which they have to be very careful with because of the ban on air traffic, that everybody knows who everybody is who's flying, and that there's communications between all of them to shuttle people out. The military has offered military aircraft for that kind of transport, and military surgeons have been brought to the scene. One thing unfolding right now is they've asked for gas to be shut off in that area for blocks and blocks, because after the 2 collapses, gas mains were opened up, and there's a gas leak in the air, which only fosters the danger of yet more explosions.
Exactly. Pierre?
Well, one of the things that they've been very concerned about in recent years is the notion that could hospitals deal with massive amounts of casualties like this. And now they're going to...
Let me just interrupt you for a second so we hear it as it's happening.
Just come out, we're walking.
Just come down. The second everyone's being asked to get down, come down. The people are now panicking again.
Give him that. You can walk. You can film it. Make a hole, man. Make a fucking hole. Make a fucking hole. Make a fucking hole. Fuck off.
Well, scene has been repeated hundreds and hundreds, and maybe, as far as we know, thousands of times. The reports in John Miller was talking about the number of hospitals and the military making its medical staff available to the citizen, to the layman hierarchy here. We've had reports from various hospitals saying that hundreds of people are burned from head to toe. One doctor at St. Vincent's Hospital in Lower Manhattan just simply said the place was crowding up very quickly by people who had been burned. And the horrifying magnitude of all this is to be reminded. I think I'm going to try to get this right, Nancy, but I think maybe as many as 50,000 people work in the immediate area of the Trade Center, of the World Trade Center, in which there are these two twin towers. Am I right on that as many as 50,000 people work in?
I don't know the figure, but the World Trade Center complex, not just the two towers, which are, over 100 stories each, but they're flanked by the World Financial Center. So there are clearly tens of thousands of people within a 2-block radius.
And John McWethy, who called in just a short while from the Pentagon, talking about the aircraft that had penetrated the outer ring of the Pentagon to the inner ring, we're talking about the Pentagon now, had many floors of destruction and heavy casualties. It's just impossible at the moment to grasp, other than to try to aggregate the normal circumstances of how many people live and work in the immediate area. And thousands of people work in the Pentagon every day, which has now been overrun by local police and by state authorities and by the military itself trying to take care of its own. Tony Cordesman, who's one of our military analysts, is on the phone from Washington. Tony, what can you add to all this?
Yes. Peter, can you hear me?
Yes, Tony, I can.
I think one of the things we need to understand is we've been preparing for this kind of event for nearly a decade. We've had presidential directives. It's a project called Homeland Defense, but quite frankly, what people were most worried about was the use of weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. Well, we looked at this scenario, hijacked aircraft flying into buildings back in the 60s. It wasn't the focus of Homeland Defense activity. It wasn't something brought up on the screen of the Vice President's office, which formally is in charge with coordinating this effort.
But Tony, you, I know, been party to a lot of... Is that speaker right here behind you?
Yes, I'm
Could you just turn around and ask somebody to turn it down?
Hold on, please. I'm on to Peter. Could you turn it down?
Thanks very much. Sorry to interrupt them because they're all doing a job. But your involvement here is important because you've been involved in so much of planning and study of this operation. I don't get it. In the 1960s, yes, we looked at the possibility that people would hijack airplanes and fly into buildings. How did it get off the radar?
I think the problem, Peter, is literally we have tens of thousands of points of vulnerability. As Jack McWethy pointed earlier, it's the Pentagon. It's symbols of our national heritage, like the National Archives. It's major utilities, nuclear power plants, targets like ABC News and the networks. The problem is that anticipating all these points of vulnerability in a democratic society and defending them is almost impossible. There's always been this area of vulnerability, and we've always put civil liberties and civil rights before trying to deal with a comprehensive defense. This may change those priorities. It certainly is something short, if not actually at the level of an act of war.
And Tony, you have seen us this morning, or heard us this morning, go through the ritual of reciting that somebody had claimed responsibility, someone had denied responsibilities. The Palestinian Authority in the person of Yasser Arafat was very quick to come along and offer condolences to the people of the United States, to put as much distance between himself, because he gets blamed for a lot in the Middle East, certainly by the Israelis. Do you have any feel for how complicated an operation this is and who might be able to mount it, or are we just blowing in the wind at the moment?
You're not blowing in the wind at all, Peter. This is so complicated an operation that one reason we weren't ready is that no one believed there was an organization with either the intention or the capability to execute something like this. People talk about bin Laden's group, but it's an umbrella group. It is the elements under it that would have had to do it, not bin Laden himself. We have talked about Iraq, but Iraq's operations have never been particularly sophisticated. We've talked about Iran, but while we can identify that the Iranian leadership was involved in Al-Khobar, we've never seen anything this ambitious. And groups outside the Middle East, like the Japanese Red Brigades, have never come close to this level of operation. I think it's also important to note that we talked earlier about bin Laden being Arab. Bin Laden's operations now have many elements that are not Arab. They are Islamist extremists. They involve groups from countries like Pakistan and other elements. And what we've never seen is a level of coordination among all of these different groups that would lead us to prepare.
Okay, Tony, thank you very much. Very, very grateful to have you here and to remind us all that what has been happening to us all, in terms of being witnesses today to this, and everybody's now gets deeply emotionally involved, the people who've been involved. Again, remind you that that many thousands of people work in the Twin Trade Towers in New York City, many thousands of people that work in the Pentagon. There have been 2 aircraft at least today which have gone down with passenger loads on board. And in fact, there has been a 3rd crash in Pennsylvania, which I shall bring you up to date on in just a moment. But we've had a written statement from American Airlines this morning, and let me just read it to you, or parts of it as it come. American Airlines confirms it lost 2 aircraft in what it describes as tragic incidents this morning. There was Flight 11, which was a Boeing 767 en route from Boston to Los Angeles with 81 passengers, 9 flight attendants, and 2 pilots on board. That aircraft was hijacked, to the best of our knowledge, and flown into the trade towers in New York. And Flight 77, a Boeing 757, offering from Washington Dulles to Los Angeles with 58 passengers and 4 flight attendants and 2 pilots. That aircraft is a little more uncertain. That is not a huge, it's a big aircraft, 757, but we're not certain whether that's the one that went into the Pentagon or whether it's one of the other aircraft that went into the Twin Trade Towers. But the government has now shut down the entire air traffic system in the United States. And we learned just a while ago, for example, that all international flights heading to Canada we're now going to be, for the United States, we're going to be diverted to Canada. And the Canadians have now shut down their entire air traffic system as well. A reminder of how close the 2 nations live together and how Canadian airports from one end of the country to the other are within an hour's flight or less in some cases of major American targets. So now let's get involved with one more crash this hour. ABC's Lisa Stark, who covers aviation, is on the phone with us from Washington, or at least I believe in our bureau. Lisa, can you hear me?
Actually, Peter, I'm in Seattle today, ironically, for an aviation conference.
Okay, well
Can you hear me, Peter?
I can indeed, Lisa, and tell me what you know.
Well, what I know is that the flight that went down outside Philadelphia, I believe, in Pittsburgh, was United Airlines Flight 93. It was a Boeing 757. It was en route from Newark to San Francisco. I do not know how many people were on board that plane. United is also saying now that they are concerned about a further flight that apparently is still missing. Flight 175, it is a Boeing 767. It was scheduled from Boston to Los Angeles. That flight apparently is still unaccounted for, according to officials from United. So at least we believe there's at least one more plane that may still be flying around, in this airspace. Obviously, Peter, I've also learned that one of the planes that went into the World Trade Tower was tracked by the FAA. They knew, I don't know if they knew it was hijacked or if they just knew something was wrong. Obviously, it had deviated from its flight path. They were able to track it on radar, and they did track it to lower Manhattan. That's the latest we know about the flight.
Lisa, this may seem an awfully dumb question, but given the fact that the airlines, the major airlines, operate in such an intensely coordinated way, at least with their own operation centers, how is United Flight 175, a 767 from Boston to Los Angeles, thought to be missing and unaccounted for?
Well, all United is saying is that they are, quote, concerned about that flight. What I believe is that probably that flight was hijacked as well. Where it is right now, I'm sure perhaps the FAA, FBI, and those folks know where it is. We are not being told, but there may still be another plane flying out there that has not yet crashed or landed or whatever will happen to it. But that is apparently at least unaccounted for at this time as far as public release. I'm sure someone knows where that flight is.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much then. Lisa Stark in Seattle today. Thought she was in Washington, covers aviation for us. Barbara Starr, one of our principal reporters at the Pentagon, I think is on the line as well. Barbara? Barbara, do you hear me? Barbara Starr?
Yes, Peter, I'm standing outside the Pentagon. About 10 or 15 minutes ago, we saw 50 to 75 military personnel move onto the helipad. They are stretcher-bearer volunteers. They have been assembled to go in and recover the potentially dead or wounded. And we have talked to an eyewitness who was down on the helipad earlier this morning, where the fire is, of course, still ongoing. He reported seeing more than a dozen wounded personnel earlier this morning. We have seen ambulances carry people off. About an hour ago, we saw emergency medical personnel bringing out a woman and a small child in their arms. So the situation here remains quite unsettled.
Can you describe a little more generally what unsettled mean? Is it calm? Is there chaos?
We have had periods of what can only be described as chaos. About 15 minutes ago, security personnel came through again and told us to start running, to move back, that there was another aircraft moving up the Potomac River from the south at a high rate of speed. Well, that apparently did not occur, and we have now moved back to our original camera position. So the police are quite at a point of quite high tension here this morning, and any little ripple is having them move people back to stay away from the building. They are extremely concerned about another attack and a potential additional explosion. They are taking every precaution.
Understandable. Barbara, the portion of the building that was breached when the aircraft crashed into it, do you know what happens in that part of the building?
Well, we're looking at it right now. Fire trucks are still pouring water more than an hour or better after the explosion onto the flames. This has occurred where the helipad is, a helicopter pad with a small control tower where military helicopters, and including Air Force One helicopters, take off and land regularly. A very senior military official told us he heard an explosion on the 5th floor of the Pentagon, and he believes that that's where the impact was. But looking at the side of the building, you can see smoke and flames, and the building is singed, literally top to bottom. Water is continuing to be poured on the flames by fire companies.
Thank you, Barbara Starr, very much. We've just seen a helicopter flying over the center portion of the District of Columbia. Maybe we get another glimpse at that. It's gone out of frame now. I am wondering now whether or not we are not possibly looking at the president returning to the White House. Claire Shipman, you've got a pretty decent vantage point over the White House. Is that possibly what we're looking at? Okay, Claire Shipman will get to us when she's got a very good vantage point over the White House. It does not by any means look like the traditional arrival of the president from Andrews Air Force Base in a Marine helicopter on the south lawn of the White House. And quite frankly, everybody on the roof, with a few remaining people on the roof of the building now. This is a permanent guard. I think we're all in the country familiar with the fact that this is a permanent military installation on the top of the White House. As is one of the really intense perimeters around that. But I think they would not have been quite so relaxed if the president was returning to the White House. And you heard John Cochran report from Florida a while ago that there is nobody's told him where the president is going to land on his way back. In fact, he does traditionally land at Andrews Air Force Base, and we have no idea precisely where he is going to land. And but there is no doubt at the moment that authorities are on alert from coast to coast still. All air traffic halted, all high-profile buildings in New York City, certainly in the District of Columbia, all of the national buildings have been evacuated. It's certainly been true in Chicago. The Sears Tower of Chicago was evacuated. So were the tallest skyscrapers in Boston, Cleveland, and Minneapolis, and the Space Needle as well in Seattle was closed. Military bases all across the country went on alert, on a variety of stages alert. In Washington, military personnel were put on what's called alert level Delta, which is the highest possible alert status, and military personnel throughout the country were put on Charlie threat level. For people who follow those things, we say them often without knowing what they mean, but they're both pretty high states of alert. There was extra security put in place at the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons and research complex in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. They put in extra security at the Los Alamos National Lab in New Mexico, and among the other places at Fort Detrick in Frederick, Maryland. This is to give you some sense of the magnitude. We're looking at a limited amount of picture of New York City and Washington, but let me go on with this list of what people did across the country today. In Louisiana, the state police urged all petrochemical and pipeline companies to be on alert. In this particular detention, a target which people who study terrorism believed which was vulnerable. In Los Angeles, all of the police in Los Angeles went on tactical alert and mobilized their anti-terrorist division. You recall before the World Trade Fair, the World Trade meeting that was held up in Seattle, one of the last times the system really worked and everybody efficiently was when they caught a guy coming across the border from British Columbia and Canada with a view to blowing up the Space Needle, I think it was at the time, in the Space Needle in Seattle.
That's what they originally suspected, and then later updated it.
Turned it into something in Los Angeles.
When he began to cooperate, he admitted his plan was to set off a massive bomb inside the terminal of LAX, Los Angeles Airport.
That's right. And what I remember at the time about that, John, which is why everybody in the country is so on edge today, is, here was a guy who was picked up by one agent at one border crossing in the country because he was sweating.
One alert agent who didn't like the fact that he was panicking.
Yeah, okay.
Under questioning.
Let me go back now to the World Trade Center. Just to finish this very quickly. Under orders from the FAA, airports nationwide are now closed all across the country. Anybody's just connecting with the world today and you're planning to go anywhere on an aircraft from one place to another, you can just forget it. So let's go back to the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan on the west side and talk to Don Daler. Don.
Over for New York yet. As you know, this is one of the most densely constructed pieces of real estate in the world, and when the Twin Towers collapsed, it appears that they ignited fires on surrounding buildings. I'm seeing a huge amount of smoke. Just about 15 minutes ago, there was a phalanx of firemen, I would say probably about 50 firemen, moving deliberately into this black cloud of smoke. They disappeared completely into it. Then about 5 minutes ago, there was quite a bit of activity as a number of police officers started moving back individuals as well as firemen who were with their fire trucks away. So they moved the line of demarcation back away from that area, and I can see at least 2 buildings look to be partially involved. Just from my vantage point, I'm about 4 blocks away from where the Twin Towers once stood. Right before the second tower collapsed, when you and John were talking about the concerns over that possibility, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani walked right past me here on Church Street and Duane Street, again about 4 blocks from that area, moving his entourage out of that region, and then just moments later was when the collapse happened. There was a complete cessation of ambulances and any kind of emergency traffic in this area for about 5 minutes, and then slowly I saw 1 or 2 ambulances trickling out of this incredible cloud of dust with debris on top of them. Some of them had broken windshields. There was a police car that came by that looked like the top had been almost completely stove in. And that's one of the most disconcerting aspects this morning has been on this avenue that has been opened up, Church Street. There's just been a trickling of emergency vehicles coming out of that scene and towards the hospitals. I'm not sure how much they've been trapped down in that area or whether they moved away and are going to some of the other area hospitals that don't come by here. But I have not seen anywhere near the number of ambulances leaving the site that one would expect.
Don, let me ask you this. Do you have, and I realize this is a tough one to ask you to speculate about, after the attack occurred on the aircraft, the first aircraft attack on one tower and then the second one, how many people managed to get out of that place before they collapsed? Have you any idea? Would you see a large number, small number?
I saw a river of people at first running when the first attack happened. There were screams. A lot of people were looking up in shock. And then about, I would say, a minute and a half later, there was a steady stream of people moving from closer to that area, running up the streets. Then, of course, as I guess is human nature, a lot of people stopped feeling that they were maybe far enough away that it was safe, started looking up, talking, pointing, and then the second plane hit. And that, again, caused another stream of panic. As the police started to respond and started to try to clear the streets, there was a very calm, organized evacuation of the southern part of Manhattan. I saw no panic whatsoever. It was very calm. The police were directing traffic, getting all the cars out of this area, getting all the people north. But when the first tower, the one that actually was that you saw, was the second tower hit, but the first tower to collapse fell, then it was mass chaos. And there were thousands of people running up the streets. This billowing cloud of dust and debris came washing up over here, four blocks away, which only exacerbated the chaos of the moment. And then from then on, from the time that the first tower collapsed, there was just the street here, Church Street, was just full of people covered in dust, holding their handkerchiefs or papers over their mouths to try to breathe, moving northward away from this area. That stream trickled out, and then when the second building collapsed, once again there were more people, but this time when the second building collapsed, I witnessed firemen who were helping one another, struggling up the street, covered in debris. There was a police officer who was being carried by two other police officers trying to get out of that area. So there was obviously a lot of collateral damage with the people around that area. I would say even not just at the base of it, but for them to have gotten to my point that quickly, they would have been injured probably two and a half blocks away from where the towers fell.
Don, thanks very much. Don't go away, because you've helped us appreciate at ground level what, as I said before, seems almost surrealistic when you look at it on television. In terms of people getting out of the trade towers, do you have any sense at all? Have you heard anything, even anecdotally, from the cops about how many people managed to get out of the building before they collapsed?
No, absolutely not. But you can imagine that the World Trade Centers, I'm not sure how many elevators exactly they have, but I have been in those buildings, and I think there are around 20 elevators in each. If they shut down immediately, you can imagine the people who would be streaming down the fire escapes and the stairwells. There's also, I don't know if it was the case now, but I do know that one of the towers had a major elevator that went all the way to the top that was malfunctioning and has been malfunctioning for at least a month. They've been having a lot of trouble with that. Not that that would have made any kind of difference, of course, once those elevators shut down. As soon as I imagine the fire alarms go on and that kind of thing, it's de rigueur that the elevators are not to be used in that situation. If the elevators go all the way to the top, and that's where the extent of the damage was at the very top of these, there's probably no way that anyone on the lower floors was able to use elevators. So they were all going down the stairwells, and one can only hope that there was quick enough reaction that they did get clear away, that they did not stop at the base.
Thank you, Don, very much. You know, somebody said, looking at the Pentagon this morning, that it reminded them of World War II. Clearly a person too young to remember World War II. But as you look at these scenes, you can feel absolutely clear that you're looking at the results of the United States at war with angry and vicious people who will do in the future, as they have in the past, whatever they can to get at the United States, this huge presence in the world, with any number of enemies in the world, with any number of people who feel the United States has messed up their lives or their countries or their movements or impeded them from something. And so, in fairness, without being too carried away with it, we are looking at pictures from a war zone this morning. Not a picture, something that looks like a war zone, looks like an old war zone, but is a picture of a current war zone in this endless battle between the United States and its enemies. Usually small groups of enemies. We're talking into countries to some extent here, but we're talking about the most unconventional form of warfare that man engages in, which is terrorism. Designed to cause terror, designed to have an impact on the psychology of Americans, designed to show that the United States is vulnerable. What better expresses American vulnerability than to watch these two symbols of American commerce and government and pride at the lower end of Manhattan collapsing in upon themselves after having been attacked by 2 hijacked aircraft. That is what it looks like at the moment. Looking out, this is from the top of the ABC building, and we're like 60, 70 blocks, 60 blocks north, more than 60 blocks north of the trade centers, and as we look down, that's what they look like under normal circumstances. We can see them from almost anywhere in the city, and people go to the top of them on a regular basis so that they can see the huge surrounding area, including, I might add, right in their face, the Statue of Liberty on a day like today. And they are both gone. Now, just to deal with the possibility of the missing United Airlines flight, the mayor of Cleveland, Michael White, says that a Boeing 767 out of Boston has made an emergency landing at Cleveland Hopkins International Airport because of concerns that it may have a bomb aboard. There is some possibility that may be the missing United flight, but we do not know. Anybody who's in an aircraft this morning and made an emergency landing safely is probably one hugely relieved person at the moment. I want to go back to Washington. Claire Shipman is just across Lafayette Park from the White House. It's a traditional place in which we broadcast from when we're covering White House and Washington affairs. Claire, do we know where the president is at the moment?
Well, Peter, that's what we've been trying to figure out. I've been told by sources that Air Force One hasn't landed yet. What we're trying to figure out is, as you were talking about earlier, where that plane will land and where the president will go. The Secret Service have essentially told me, we have an emergency plan in place for exactly this sort of thing, and of course, we're not going to tell you where we take our protectees, including the president. And there was some question about whether he would even land, as he normally does, at Andrews Air Force Base. Now, there is a small press pool traveling with him on Air Force One. I've been told they may stick fairly close with him once he does land, so we may learn something more. But in addition, the entire staff of the White House and the old Executive Office building, State Department, has been scattered around town. There's no reaching anybody from the NSC, the press office. They're all trying to set up temporary offices, and at some point they may have them up and running. But right now, there's very little information about how this government is running and from where it's being run.
And of course, Claire, these are all really, truly important psychological factors in the war between the United States and those people who would harm it, because if the government is seen to be in, I don't mean to suggest disarray, but seen to be uncertain, then this is going to simply make America's enemies happier.
Oh, absolutely. This is exactly the sort of response they would like to have. And of course, this government doesn't make this sort of evacuation decision lightly. Remember what you were talking earlier about the Oklahoma City bombing. They didn't evacuate at that point. We all stayed in the White House because they didn't feel it was necessary, and they don't want to do it unless they believe it is absolutely necessary.
I have been saying, perhaps you will think too blithely, that the president is no safer than he is in the White House. Is that the convention?